Kennedy, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 13, written by L. Muir, narrated by Jenn McGuirk and Andrew McDermott.
Chapter 1. Culloden Moor, Night. After the departure of Jacques, Macbeth, and Dougal Cameron, the spirits of Culloden's 79 settled a bit. No doubt they all wondered, as Kennedy did, if the late hour meant their witch would call it a night, but Sansaray lingered. In the centre of the gathering, the burning pyre waned as the young witch paced round it in a circle, her dark robes trailing behind her. With a flick of her wrist, the flames strengthened and sparks flew into the inky night sky, as if she'd tossed a heavy stump upon the phantom logs that burned at her command. Each night that she had returned, she'd summoned the fire back, and it sprang up as alive and hungry as when she'd built it, from earthly wood in the wee hours of the summer solstice. Would it ever burn itself away? What a blessing such a fire would have been on the night before the battle, when their thousands had been chilled to the bone. For it was a mean combination: cold, hunger, fatigue. 3 formidable allies to place on the side of the enemy. For the Duke's army had been well outfitted, well fed, and well rested. The Highlanders would have fought well in any case, of course. It was the terrain that turned the tide, and their leader who could not see it. But still, if those warriors could have known such a fire for a wee while, and had perhaps 10 minutes' sleep. Kennedy wondered just how warm that fire might be with only supernatural wood. And since it seemed no more real than Culloden's 79, might they somehow feel it? Sansaray turned as if she'd heard the question in Kennedy's mind. With a laughing smile, she beckoned with both hands. "Come here, Kennedy, and see for yourself." A nod of her head made it plain. The witch was insisting. Still the soldier held back, hoping the remainder of the 79 would be sent first, so there would be no audience for the impending argument. But there was a mischievous glint in Sonny's eye that made it clear she would love nothing more than to expose Kennedy's secret to the others. And when she did, it would be impossible to remain on the moor a moment afterward. "Come," the witch invited. "Come and ease your burden, Kennedy. I'll be surprised if every man here doesn't already know your secrets." Eager to stop the witch from speaking another word, Kennedy cut through the crowd with a brisk stride and a warning glower. However, the young woman's smile only broadened as the soldier drew near. 5 feet from the fire, Kennedy hissed, "Danny, do this!" Sonny's smile dropped away. "Forgive me, but there is no use dragging it out, eh? Your quest awaits, your boon as well." "I want nothing of the boon, do you hear? I only wish to abide here in peace. Only hell awaits me, Sonny, and you ken it. There is no room in heaven for the anger in my breast." The witch's head shook. "Nay, I will not believe it." Kennedy took a menacing step forward, and the green light that usually swirled languidly around Sonny's knees rose up between them. A thin wall of emerald-tinged faces warned the soldier to retreat. For a drawn-out moment, Kennedy considered defying them. But it was the unease of the 79 that finally got the soldiers' attention. They, too, would protect the witch from one of their own if need be. In disgust, Kennedy stomped away, then turned back to the fire and Sansaray, if only to avoid the inquisitive looks from the others. At least one question had its answer. There was no warmth to the flames. Such an unnatural fire would have been a comfort to no one before the battle, just as it was no comfort now. A loud curse carried across the wet air. Kennedy turned to the left and found Gerard Ross stomping in their direction, his brow a dark cloud. Both Kennedy and Sonny took a step back.
"Enough of this foolishness. You will go and do as you're bidden, and count yourself blessed that you will not pass another night on the moor."
He continued to advance until his boots nearly touched the soldiers.
This is no place for young Rabbi, and is no place for ye. I've always kenned your reasons for haunting this sorry place were not the same as the rest.
He lifted his arm in a wide circle.
We've all kenned it thus, and we have allowed ye your privacy, but ye must trust our sonny. She did well by Rabbi, she'll do well by ye.
Lass. The word was like an arrow in the heart. Nearly 270 years of hiding amongst them, and they'd known all the while? Mortified and feeling a fool, she kept her eyes downcast.
Look at me, lass. Look at me.
Ross's voice was compelling, as was the temptation to drink in the sight of the handsome warrior, now that they were nose to nose. His ice-blue eyes searched for her very soul.
I would know your name.
His eyes narrowed.
Turn loose your hair, lassie.
She shook her head. If I go, you'll not be seeing me again. Kennedy will do.
Nay, lass, I will have your name. I vow it rests on the tip of my tongue, but you must help me.
His nostrils flared, his lowered brow demanded. But it was the caress of his voice she could not deny. I am Nessa. His face fell. Gerard Ross kenned the meaning well enough then, kenned Irish mythology. He would be hard-pressed to forget her now. She certainly wouldn't be forgetting him. Time hadn't mattered. Whether it was a day, a week, or several centuries, she would have been just as taken with the man. The way he moved, spoke, looked, he'd been an obsession from the beginning. But it was in the flesh that she had noticed him first, and it was her mortal woman's heart that remembered him and honoured him for what she'd seen. He'd been one of 3 men she'd remembered from the battle, perhaps brothers or clansmen, perhaps strangers. They'd stood together to meet the advancing redcoats and done well. When Nessa hadn't been engaged in the fight herself, she'd glanced off to her right to see how the trio fared. One man's leg was sliced open. Ross exchanged a look with the 3rd man, who'd quickly bent and lifted the injured man over his shoulder, then turned and fought his way back out of the mud, away from the fight. Ross tossed his targe aside, filled both his hands with steel, and took on the 5 Hanoverians intent on running past him. And he laid them all low before he toppled to the ground, never to rise again as a living, breathing man. His spirit, however, was a sight to behold. At least Nessa had always thought so. The rest of the 79 gave him due respect, but never appreciated what she had. She'd assumed it was only because they hadn't witnessed his sacrifice on the battlefield. But standing there, facing him, no longer playing at being a lad, she had to admit that her admiration had much more to do with her woman's heart, where she still possessed of one. She'd been careful to never get too close to any of Culloden's 79, save Rabbi. The boy had reached her side before she'd realised the truth, that she had not risen from the battlefield to go home again, but to remain. And before she'd thought to hide her sex, the lad had seen enough to know. For the longest while, she'd been glad of her ethereal existence, still seething with anger for her brother and cousins who had ignored her pleas to stay out of the fight. She'd had no wish to move on to the next life if it meant the 4 lads would be waiting there for her. Of course, she missed them after a while, and sometimes she was shaken by aspects of her new reality. But all things passed eventually, and there was nothing on Culloden Moor that could break her heart or trip her temper again. There she was free, and, apart from the occasional reminder from both the living and the dead, she was able to forget the horrible loss of her kinsmen and countrymen for long stretches. Life was simple. No meals to cook or rugs to beat, no dogs or muddy small brothers to chase away from her newly cleaned floors, no need to ration the peat for the fire. Life as a ghost was peaceful. No downside, as the Americans would say. But when she thought about those 4 stubborn idiots she called kin, That piece sizzled and died like water dripped in a hot pot. She was just careful not to think of them too much. And moving on to the next life or the hereafter was something she would fight against tooth and nail, for she was fair to certain what awaited her. Either she would burn in the fires of hell for the anger in her heart, or she would, by some miracle, be pardoned and allowed into heaven. But if she were permitted to walk down streets of gold, her unbending, pig-headed kin would be accepted there as well. And one look at their aggravating faces and those golden streets would be torn to bits with their fighting. For it was a fact she would take their heads off for not listening to her back in April of 1746. She put her chin to the air. "I'll not go, Ross." He raised a single eyebrow, no doubt intending to cow her. His hand rose slowly toward her cheek, and she closed her eyes, wishing she could feel his touch, even if it were only for a moment. The sudden splash of tires on the wet paved drive drew everyone's attention, including Nessa's. The vehicle stopped where the wee road bent closest to the battlefield, where cars were not allowed to park. A solitary man emerged wearing a black leather coat that quickly grew shiny with the rain and reflected the flashes of Sansare's fire. When he drew within 100 feet of their gathering, it became clear that he could see all in attendance. His gaze took them in, but his expression was guarded. That was, until he looked at the wee witch. He gave her a wink and a smile.
"Good evening, niece."
"Uncle." She hurried to him and wrapped her arms around him. There was no ring of green light to hinder their embrace. The only illumination, for the moment, was the orange glow and yellow flashes from the bonfire. All Sonny's waiting and pacing must have been for this man. Eventually the witch and her uncle turned to face Nessa. Still standing next to her, Ross took a step that put his spectre between them, as if he didn't trust the newcomer. And since she trusted Ross's instincts, she decided she should be wary as well, even though the man was obviously kin to their Sonny.
"Not a step closer,"
Ross warned. Though how he imagined this man was a threat to either of them, she didn't know. The uncle slowed and stopped. With a bemused frown, he looked Ross over from head to toe and back again.
"Ah, you must be Gerard Ross then."
The warrior nodded.
"I am Wickham. My niece needs help sending Miss Kennedy where she must go. I am that help."
He tipped his head to the side to get a better look at her, but she had the feeling he also mocked Ross for trying to protect her.
"It is the lass's turn, aye."
He gave her a wink and straightened, raising his brows at the warrior, and waited. Sonny pushed her way between them. "Was it not you, Gerard Ross, who just insisted Nessa stop her foolishness and be gone from here, She rolled her eyes. "What is so different now?" Ross stood still for a long moment, then turned to face Nessa.
"Sonny trusts him."
She nodded. "Seems so." He shrugged.
"Nothing for it, then. Fare thee well, lass."
Nessa nodded, not trusting her voice. Once again his hand rose to caress her cheek, and she could swear she felt the brush of his fingers. The sensation was fleeting and probably imagined, but she vowed she would never forget it.
"Almost like a memory,"
he whispered. Then reluctantly, his awe-inspiring self stepped aside, but remained within an arm's length of her. She swallowed her regret and faced the man in black, who looked far too young to be called uncle. He stepped close and smiled.
"Hello."
"Hello?"
"Don't be nervous, Nessa."
"I am not," she lied.
"Good. Now, you must hold on to me. You see, you canna let go. So place your arms over mine and grab tight, aye."
He held out his forearms with supplicant hands. When she rested her arms on his, he took a firm hold of her elbows. She grasped him in kind, though she had a shorter reach. She glanced to the side, hoping the sight of Gerard Ross would be a lasting image to take with her. But he wasn't there. Nothing was there. No flicker of a bonfire, no shifting of shadows as the ghosts moved and shuffled about for a better view. She turned to look at Sonny, but she was gone too. There was no night, no day, no grey in between. It was as if she and Wickham existed not at all, standing in a place that wasn't there. Too frightened by what she couldn't see, she closed her eyes. So the first sensation to return to her was sound. Rain drummed on a piece of wood. Pat, 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 pat. It tapped fast against a ceramic bell. Tink, tink, tink. She knew the pitch and tone of each. By heavens, she was home. Chapter 2. Nessa's father and uncle had been fortunate in the 18th century. They'd worked 2 fine plots of land that had produced thriving animals and healthy crops, and thanks to the many Kennedy children, mostly her cousins, the laird had never seen fit to put that land in anyone's hands but the brothers. So in addition to the full bellies and warm fires most evenings, they'd also known peace, until bonny Prince Charlie arrived in the Isles. Nessa dared not to blink her eyes for fear the vision and sensations might be gone again, that she might wake and find she'd only been dreaming of home. With Wickham still holding to her arms, however, she allowed herself to hope.
Aye, lass, you're home.
She shook her head unbelieving. But when am I home, sir?
April 1746. Sonny said it's all you've wished for through the years to come back and try again to save someone.
Her heart soared. It was true. She was home. And now she would have that chance to use all the arguments she'd wished she could have used so long ago, to help her brother Jackie see what folly it would be to join the fight. She looked around the room, worried who might be watching and listening. For how would she explain the man she'd returned with? Luckily the cottage was empty, except for a familiar figure standing at the kitchen table with a wet cloth in her hands. It was herself. The other her looked up just then, and their gazes clashed. But before Nessa had time to do more than open her mouth, her other self faded, like a bit of ground wheat flour, blown into the wind. She was gone. Nessa turned to Wickham, but the only thing remaining of him was the warmth she still felt beneath her arms, and even that faded quickly. She was standing alone in the centre of her childhood home, with nothing to prove that the Battle of Moor had ever taken place. Nothing other than her own memories of the fight, and nearly 100,000 days since then. She felt a sudden chill and wrapped her arms around herself for comfort. The harsh cloth of her shirt sleeve was something she hadn't truly felt for centuries. Though it was rough and made her skin suddenly itch, she was still grateful for the sensation. She caught sight of her reflection, however, in the glass of the window and realised how starkly different she'd looked in men's clothing compared to what the other her had been wearing. If she didn't change, and quickly, she would have much explaining to do. The ladder to the loft bent with her weight, a weight she hadn't known for so long it made her laugh. In her end of the loft, sectioned off with a squat folding screen, she found her clothes waiting just where she'd left them. The gown the other her had worn a moment ago now hung on a peg. For some reason she felt it wise to present herself just as that Nessa had looked, so she slipped it on. But it was only a matter of time before the game would be up. After all, she'd forgotten so much about her life. She wondered if she could play the role believably. Life. It was good to feel it coursing through her veins again, shaking her bones with each beat of her heart. So strange to hear the rasp and clap of her eyelids each time she blinked. Funny. She never remembered her ears working quite so well before. By the time she finished changing and hiding the trews, shirt and vest in an old satchel beneath her bed, she'd become accustomed to the sounds and sensations of her new body, and she was able to listen outside herself again. The front door opened below, and someone stomped their feet.
Ursa, Where are ye, lass?
Here, Da, she answered without thinking. I'll be right down. Nervously, she grabbed onto the top of the ladder and swung around to the outside of it, careful to hold doubly tight to make up for the unfamiliar feeling of gravity. Asa. She'd nearly forgotten her old name, until Gerard Ross had asked her. She'd disremembered the change she had made as soon as she had risen from the ground, and which she'd bled out her life. In Irish mythology, Asa had been the daughter of a king, but raised by 12 stepfathers. When she returned home one day to find all of them murdered, she'd changed into a vengeful hunter and converted her name to Nessa. Where Asa meant gentle, Nessa meant the opposite. For she'd become the opposite the moment her brother had been cut down on the battlefield. She would never again be Asa, but for the day or two she'd been allotted, she could at least answer to the name. She jumped before she got to the last rung and ran to her father, wrapping her arms around his large form. He smelled the same. She'd forgotten that as well. He pushed her away, suspicious.
What have you done? Burned dinner?
Neither. I just thought I might tell you how much I appreciated you.
It doesn't smell burned,
he said, sniffing the air. Nessa sighed and stared at her father just a moment more, then hurried to the kitchen to see what the other her had been cooking. If the man was expecting dinner, it was midday, and it stood to reason there would be something in the small stone oven or in the pot over the fire. To her delight, there were both. Her mother had been dead for 6 years after giving birth to her brother Fingal, but Nessa's Aunt Kate, who lived just down the way, had taught her to cook as well as her mother had, or nearly so. And after hundreds of years without a smell or a taste of anything on her tongue, her own cooking was a treat she could never have predicted, even when Sonny had begun sending spirits from the Moor. Perfectly toasted buns she pulled from the oven. She swung the hook away from the fire and lifted a heavy pot of beef stew. If her nose was in true form, the other her had added a bit of bacon to help the salt along. Her father sat down at the table and grunted in anticipation. It was the closest thing to appreciation she would get from him, and she knew it. So she forgot about all the sentimental foolishness she had seen on the telly about families sharing their honest feelings. Mercy, but there was no place for such mawkishness in her current century. With her attention focused on the careful handling of hot pans, she hadn't prepared herself for the shock of seeing her brothers, both of them hale and hearty again. She nearly dropped the buns while she stood agape, staring at Jackie, the lad whom she remembered being much younger than he now looked. At the age of 17, and 2 years her junior, his age had been the most bitter point of their contention, but their cousins insisted it was only her motherly imagination that made her see him as a lad and not the man he was. Now staring at him across an impossible expanse of time, she wondered if she might have been wrong on that point.
If it tastes half so good as it smells, sister,
Jackie said,
I'll eat Fingal's share and feel no guilt o'er it. No one will eat my share but me.
6-year-old Fingal slapped the table in a show of manliness, but only managed to hurt his hand. Nessa couldn't resist hugging him from behind and ruffling his copper curls that matched her own.
Pipe down,
her dad grumbled.
If ye eat your share first, I give ye permission to dig into Jackie's portion.
The laddie's eyes bulged, and he hopped onto the chair Jackie had pulled out for himself, then lifted his bowl and waited anxiously to be served. His brother chuckled and moved down to the small stool upon which Fingal usually perched. Instead of the wee lad's usual complaints, he tucked into his meal with gusto. Nessa leaned over and kissed her father on his balding head. Thank you for that. The man blushed and frowned, then attacked his own meal with exaggeration, as if he were afraid his smallest son would try to help him eat it. The 4 of them laughed together. The tableau warmed her heart and she took a mental photograph and tucked it away in her mind to savour again at a later time. And while she did, she found a generous number of other such occasions she had hidden away. Special days, perfect moments, like small photographs from her life, she'd hidden away in a cabinet and forgotten. And now that she'd reopened that door, they came spilling out again. Memories of her mother braiding her hair. Her father's antics had the woman laughing so hard she had to start again and again. She remembered the first time she'd made buns. Even with Kate's help, they resembled clods of horse dung, only without the usual green. The night her mother had died, the entire family stood around her uncle's grand fireplace and sang dirges. No one told her not to cry. No one shamed her for doing so. Many wept openly with her and her father, man and woman alike. Family was such a strange phenomenon, something mysterious, something unfathomable. Nessa looked around the table once again and willed her memory to store the image, and hopefully the impression of belonging in it. The rest of the afternoon respite went as it always had. Her father smoked a pipe and told Fingal wild stories that would keep a lesser lad awake at night. But since it was the stuff upon which Fingal had been weaned, he only laughed and giggled at the most frightening portions of the tale. If there were gory parts, he'd asked for the details to be repeated. Nessa wondered if her father told such stories to steel the laddie for truly frightening moments that came in every life. Perhaps one day, when he stood on a battlefield, he wouldn't be frozen in fear when he found himself soaking his heels in someone else's blood, or worse. Once her da and Fingal headed back to the fields, Jackie slipped out the door before Nessa had a chance for a private word. She wasn't sure just how close they were to the day of the battle, so she couldn't guess if the lad's blood was already boiling. Regardless of the date, however, she had no more than a day or two to accomplish what she had come for. No matter how Jackie felt about the fighting at that moment, she knew she had come to a decision to join Charles Stuart's army. There was no time to spare. She had to broach the subject with him. After all, she was required to do some noble deed, and saving her brother's life seemed to be her destiny. Please, God, let it be my destiny. Chapter 3. Nessa was left alone in her home, with no family about. It once again felt as though the place belonged to that other her. And in 2 days hence she expected that other her to return, don her apron, and start fixing supper. She banked the kitchen fire and cleaned up the table. Anxious to speak with Jackie, she sat in her mother's rocker and waited for him to return from his chores. That might take him from one Kennedy farm to the other. But Jackie didn't return for a long while. Damn him. And after an hour of practicing her argument, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Some noise awakened her, and she prayed it was her brother. That prayer was quickly answered when the door burst open and Jackie hurried into the house with a wide grin on his face. Unfortunately, she remembered him doing that before, with his cousins close on his heels. Ian, Hughie and Jamie filled the doorway and spilled into the cottage.
"Woman of the house,"
Ian bellowed.
"we've an ache in our bellies for want of your fine cooking."
"Nay," she bellowed back. "Let your mother feed you ravenous swine." Then she flung herself into the open arms of her nearest cousin, Jamie, with a combination of old habit and new joy at seeing the lads alive again. After Hughie and then Ian gave her a good squeeze, she remembered having done all that before as well. But she determined to hide her unease. The way she interacted with her cousins came so naturally to her then, none of them would suspect she was some imposter from the future. And the knowledge gave her pause. Of course, she was relieved she would not have to explain herself. But she had a niggling worry she barely dared allow into her mind. That perhaps nothing about the past was within her power to change. But that was nonsense. Of course she could make the lads see reason. She had a great many facts she hadn't had before, so her arguments should better sway them than they had in the distant past. Ian stuck his fingers into the depths of the dark pot over the cold fire, and she laughed, knowing he found nothing there. "Go on with ya," she said. Your mother would be glad to fill your bellies and hear your grand tales. But recognising the chance to change their minds, she bid them sit for a moment or two to rest their sorry boots. I suppose you've come from Doon, where you've loitered all spring, leaving your mother heartbroken. Ian looked at her sideways.
Father must have told ye.
Nay, I have my own sources, you might say. As Cromarty's men, you've no doubt been stuck at Doon Castle, as reinforcements for the McGregors, aye? Hughie frowned at Jackie.
Been discussing politics with your sister, have ye? There's no need to worry a woman over something she can't understand.
He clouded Jackie on the head.
I've only told her I meant to join Cromarty when the snow was gone. She believes I'd be a fool to fight for a man who doesn't ken which side to take. But I told her what you said, Ian, that the Earl only waited to put off the enemy. You didn't speak politics with a woman, you wee scunner.
Ian clouded him that time, and her brother was at least smart enough to move to the other side of the room, beyond the reach of all three cousins. Nessa leaned close to a figurine on the mantel and blew the dust from it. Many a wise man will be sitting out this coming battle, she said, then walked to the cabinet and pretended to search for something. Jamie snorted.
Many a wise man? And who told ye such rubbish? A pack of gossips.
She shook her head and smiled cryptically before turning her back again. They say Cumberland has found a way to thwart the Highland charge.
Pigs and balderdash.
Ian came to stand beside her.
I'll tell ye what Cumberland's done, Asa. He's gotten a bunch of women to spread his lies and undermine the Jacobite army, but we willna listen. No real man will. Every true Scot will fight.
In one stroke, her cousin had stripped her of all chance to influence her brother. If Jackie hadn't listened to her before when she'd pleaded with him to wait until summer to join the army, he certainly wouldn't listen to her now. Ian made it clear, anyone who wouldn't fight, no matter what reason, wasn't a true man. And worse, wasn't a true Scot. She could read the new determination on her brother's face as if someone had written it there.
I'm no coward.
However, she reasoned, if nothing she said would matter, if she truly could not save her brother, as she had only dreamed, she might as well vent her spleen, aye? If no one would heed her warnings, she could at least hold them captive for a moment and make them hear her, for once. She was Nessa, once again, standing on the moor the day after the battle, watching Cumberland's brutes rolling and sliding her cousins' bodies close to the cart, then tossing them onto the pile of the other true Scots. She'd walked along behind, like a one-woman funeral procession, escorting them to the gaping trench that would be their grave. The stone that would eventually lie above them would read, MacDonald's. None of the redcoats took note of their faces, their plaid. There was no one to identify them except the ghost of a cousin who couldn't be heard. Well, now she would be. Shall I tell you how the battle will go, lads? She wandered around to the back of the rocker and leaned on the corners. I wonder, when you realise I was right, will you be wise and flee?
It's not in us to desert, Asa.
Jamie's tone held a warning. She ignored it. The night before the battle, with troops starved and shivering, you'll be ordered to march all night to take the enemy by surprise. Only the enemy won't be lying abed as you were led to believe, and you'll have to march back. By sunrise, you'll be hard-pressed to lift your swords, but no matter, you'll never get the chance, laddies, for the bog will slow your feet, and their artillery will cut you down. A loud crack sounded in her ears, and the room spun away into darkness and sharp pain. Ian had struck her. She spun to find him raising his hand to do it again, but Jackie hung on his arm to stop him.
You've sold yourself to the devil, have ye, Asa? Now you're a witch able to see the future.
She sighed, then nodded and laughed while she held her sore face against her arm. Hughie laughed too.
She only tries to frighten you, brother. Are you frightened? Have you pissed yourself yet? If you do, she'll make you clean the floor, remember.
The rest of them laughed at a shared memory from years before, when Ian's puppy piddled on the floor and Nessa forced him to clean it up, all while holding on to his ear. Perhaps Ian well remembered that sore ear because he wasn't laughing.
No more of that talk, cousin. It will upset your da if we have to burn you at the stake, aye.
His smirk brought on more laughter, but there was some reservation in his eyes that suggested that he had been rattled more than he would ever let on. After all the times he'd tormented her throughout their childhood, she couldn't resist. "And if the night raid fails, Ian, what will you do?" He lifted his arm just enough to promise he would smack her again if she persisted. So she nodded, telling him she understood. But it was gratifying, truly, to see that reservation in his eyes turn to worry. And she didn't believe it was worry for her soul, but worry for her predictions would come true. With a stiff farewell, the cousins left for home. They would stay the night before moving on to meet the rest of Cromarty's troops, expected to come south. She was tempted to tell them that Cromarty wouldn't make it to the next battle. If she remembered rightly, they would be ambushed the following night, with many killed and nearly all of them taken prisoner. The Jacobite army would be short another 200 men come the 16th. Jackie left the cottage as well to get back to work, preparing the barn for the animals due to be born in a week or more. Remembering her own duties, she went to feed the chickens, and while she tossed grains on the ground, she wondered if her witchly warning had been enough. When Ian was faced with the prospect of a night raid, would he be wise enough to lead his brothers and Jackie away from the battle to come? But Jamie's words came back to her.
It's not in us to desert.
And it wasn't in Ian to admit that a woman might have been right after all. The sound of cracking wood was followed by a curse from Jackie. So Nessa hurried to the barn to see if her brother needed help. He was still cursing when she opened the door. It took time for her eyes to adjust to the darkness within, and even longer to reconcile what she thought she saw. But eventually she realized that her brother was hanging upside down, bouncing his shoulder against a thick wood pillar while he tried to reach his foot, which was caught in a rope hanging from the loft. She giggled. "What was your plan, brother?" He pushed with his shoulder, so his body swung around to face her.
It's complicated.
"I can see that." He stifled his frown.
Dear, sweet Asa.
"Spare me." She strode over to the pillar and found the tangle that kept her brother aloft. Keep him. Keep him. She could keep him home with just a little rope and a gag. She would definitely need a gag. Chapter 4. With Jackie complaining all the while, Nessa first secured his hands to the pillar just below his hanging head. Next, she ripped a length of fabric from the hem of her shift and pushed it between his teeth. The poor lad had assumed she was toying with him until that moment. By the time he realized he could spit the cloth out, she was sliding her hair ribbon over his mouth to keep the cloth inside. He was at her mercy. Confident he could not escape, she pulled the stool close, climbed upon it, and untied the tangle around his feet. His boots swung away and down to the ground while his hands remained in place. They were then too high for him to reach the ribbon around his head. If it hadn't been for that gag, she was sure he would have thought her clever. He tried to speak calmly. She shrugged. "I dinna ken what you're saying, brother, but here." She patted the stool. "Rest yourself. I have a feeling you'll be here for a while. At least until our cousins have gone on their way tomorrow. Perhaps longer. Until you see reason." He shouted at her when she recognised the word father. "Oh, dinna fass yoursel. I'll have an excuse or two at the ready to tell him why he hasn't seen you about. And I'll volunteer for your chores, and he'll have no need to come in here. He's preparing the fields, aye? No time to play about with the animals, which reminds me, I'll be back with your supper when I come to milk the cows." She ignored his struggling, patted him on the cheek, then turned serious. "I believe in a few days you'll be very grateful I kept you from the battlefield. Trust me." She had to turn her head away and pretend she hadn't seen the hate in his eyes. She only wished she would still be around when that hate turned into something sweeter.
Poor kid,
Her father said, and took his place at the table.
She didn't need yet another mouse to feed tonight.
Nessa waved away his concern. She will nae mind Jackie joining them. 'Tis as easy to feed 11 as it is to feed 10.
I suppose.
He winked at Fingal.
The more for us, aye.
Fingal moved over into Jackie's chair again, as he'd done for dinner that day. And if it weren't for Nessa tying up his brother in the barn, young Fingal might have been free to sit in that spot for evermore. But thankfully, in another 2 days, there would be no need for Jackie to run off and play soldier, man or not. She finished her meal quickly. The bowl of potatoes and thick meat gravy she'd set aside for her captive was easily hidden beneath her shawl when she excused herself to do the milking. Nessa was confident she would think of another excuse for his absence come morning. She hadn't thought to put on mittens, what with the bowl in one hand and the lantern in the other, so the cold, wet wind chilled her fingers to the bone before she reached the barn door. She couldn't wait to get her hands on a nice warm cow. She set the lantern on the ground to unbar the door, then picked it up again and stepped inside. Ginger mooed at her. Or was it Jackie's welcome she heard? The stool was bare. She lifted the lantern higher, hoping to see his form on the far side of the pillar, but he was truly gone. The ropes lay in pieces in the dirt. Whether the cousins returned for him or he found a way out of her knots, it made no matter. Jackie was gone, angry and gone. Nessa walked numbly to collect the smaller stool, plucked up a clean bucket and made her way to Ginger's side. The milk wouldn't drop until her hands were good and warm, but once it did, Nessa's tears began to fall as well. "I cannot believe I couldn't save him," she told the cow, her throat clogged with centuries of tears. "I couldn't save any of them." It was a long, tortured evening by the time she'd milked both cows and cried herself dry. And in spite of her mortal state and the exertion, she grew colder and deader inside. Except for the sting in her fingers, she might as well have been a ghost again. For all she cared, the cold wind of Cromarty Firth could freeze her where she stood. There was nothing left for her to do. Sansaray had every reason to retrieve her and be done with it. However, she was now eager to reach the afterlife, for if she found Jackie, Ian and the others, there would be one hell of a reunion, wherein she would bellow at the top of her lungs, "I told you not to go!" But Sonny didn't come. The cold wind eventually crept beneath her shawl and brought on a parade of chills she could not ignore, so she went back into the house. She took one last long look at her father's sleeping form, at his warm pipe lying on the mantel, and a final glance around the house, in case Sonny came for her in the night. She watched over Fingal for a wee while, caressing his small hands and his copper curls. Finally he rolled away from her and she found her bed. Lying on her back, she searched the rafters. Every night of her life she'd stared at them, and yet it was so long ago she vaguely remembered the pattern of the shadows. She cast her mind back to that self-same day, when she had been the other her. She and Jackie had argued yet again. She begged, then she'd harped, until they were both fit to be tied. When she woke in the morning on the 15th, her brother had been packing a rucksack and explained to Da why he had to go. Their father hadn't put up much of a fuss. The man had to test himself, he'd said, in a voice that suggested John Kennedy had done some testing in his own time. But neither would Da join the fight. That alone should have given Jackie pause, but he'd united with the cousins in the yard and gone on his merry way. After feeding her father and brother a mere 5 hours later, Nessa had worked herself into a tizzy. She'd waited until her father was in the field before she gave Fingal a message to relay to him, that she had gone after Jackie to bring him home, and that Kate would have to feed Fingal and him for a day or two. But that had been the other her. Question was, what would she do this time? If she lit out now, could she find the lads sooner? With a little more time, could she sway them, If she simply bashed Jackie on the head and kept him unconscious until after the battle, the butcher of Cumberland and his men would finish him off, believing him one of the injured to whom no quarter would be given. So if she were to try such a tactic, she would have to do so far from the battlefield. But in the past, she hadn't found him until the morning of the battle, standing on the field itself just an hour before the first shot. Heartsick, she covered her eyes with her arm and tried to calm her wayward thoughts. It was no use. The look in their eyes that afternoon had been the same as when she had gone to them on the battlefield to urge them one last time to flee. I am no coward. I am no coward. Even when they'd stared at the enemy across the disastrous bog, even when they'd known their chances. She wished she would have warned them about the butchery that would come after, but they wouldn't have believed it any easier than they'd believed the rest. What good would it do to follow them now? She would rather not relive that bloody day, but was she meant to? Sunsere, she whispered to the rafters. Have I failed? Is there truly nothing noble I can do now? No longer sure of how to spend her final gift of mortal time, she closed her eyes and drifted through fuzzy and faded memories of long ago. In the wee hours before dawn, she startled and woke. The other her would have left that day for Culloden. Should she do the same, or could she change something by remaining at home? She wished she had been given some instruction before Wickham had whisked her away from the moor, but she supposed it was not possible for him or Sonny to know what would happen to her. Or was it? Did the pair already know that history could not be changed in the end? Did they know that she'd be doing everything possible to sway her family to stay away from Culloden, and that she would do so in vain? Her stubborn nature balked at the idea. She had never been one to sit still when told she should stay put. Of course history could be changed, she reasoned. She had already done things differently than she had before. Her brother was on the road to Culloden far earlier this time. When their father rose that morning, Jackie wouldn't be on hand to explain why he felt compelled to join the fight, or ask for the man's blessing. Her father would be hurt to find his eldest son gone without a word. That history had changed. Fingal would not have the chance to bid his brother farewell. That history had changed. Nessa swung her feet to the floor and slipped them into her favourite brown boots, a different pair than those she had worn to Culloden long ago. She also donned a different dress, a heavier coat. Her own history was about to change, and if she could change hers, maybe she could change someone else's. Chapter 5. That morning after milking the cows, Nessa took great care cooking the meal. Firstly, it was only the second meal she'd prepared in centuries, and she'd forgotten enough to worry. But her body seemed to remember well enough to get her by. She watched, entranced, as her hands reached for salt or lard, shuffled the coals to adjust the heat, or knew when to stop fiddling with the dough and call it good. Secondly, she wanted the meal to be special, if only because it would be the last she would ever share with Fingal and her da. And lastly, she hoped a good meal would help soften the blow of the news of Jackie. Not wanting to spoil the taste of the food, she waited until her da had only his tea left to drink, before she confessed that Jackie must have left in the night, and she was certain he'd gone with Ian and the others to join the Jacobite army. She also confessed to trying to hold him captive in the barn. Her father was stoic as usual, a nod and a frown. Never a harsh word about someone who was not present to defend themselves. Only a touch of disappointment, a sad smile, and a new line of worry across his brow.
God go with them all.
When he sent Fingal over to Kate's house to ask for an extra lad to come and help with the animals, while he tended to the fields. Before Fingal reached the door, however, Nessa scooped him into her arms and lifted him up to her face. Fingal.
Aye.
I willna be here when you return, so I thought perhaps you'd like to kiss me before you go. He wrinkled his small, freckled nose in distaste, then laughed and planted a kiss on her cheek.
You'll come back, though, aye.
She forced a smile. I certainly hope so.
Then put me down.
Recognizing his logic, she lowered him to his feet and he scampered out the door, eager to run his errand. Kate's house had ever been the favourite place for all the lads. Their aunt kept biscuits at the ready to fill every corner of her growing lad's stomach, and those of the older lads who only grew their bellies. She had no doubt Fingal would return with a few heavy-laden pockets. Her da rose and moved to the window where he stood still as a tree, peering out at something unseen. It was his quiet way of mourning. She hated to disturb his thoughts, but had no choice. Da?
You're going after him then?
He said without turning. It was a relief not to need to utter the words herself. I cannot sit idle and wait. I've a bad feeling about the coming battle. He turned to frown at her.
Coming battle?
Aye. Under a mossy moor. What else might she say without sounding mad? The Jacobites are due a loss, eh? And Jackie should not be the one to pay for that loss. Her dad nodded, but she wondered if he understood more than her mere words. Could a parent tell when their daughter had been replaced by a different version of herself? Or was he only worried to see a woman sticking her nose into the politics of the land? His large, fur-covered arms wrapped around her and pulled her close.
I am frightened for ye, Asa. Dinna travel alone.
I will find others.
Keep a knife tucked.
I have 3.
And if ye cannot turn your brother's nose to home.
Unless God himself inspires me to do otherwise, I'll return, thither mine. He took hold of her shoulders and held her away from him. Only when he was satisfied with something in her eyes did he nod and drop his hands away.
God go with ye.
She fought back an army of tears, took up the sack she had already prepared and left her house for the final time, again. Nessa was tempted to hurry up the rise to Kate's house, if only for a brief look at the woman who had been a mother to her. A clearer memory of Kate's face, however, was not worth the risk of time. So Nessa refrained. Her heavy, hooded coat covered her to the knees and would weigh her down at the end of the day. But she also knew the cold that would come, and a woman huddling and hiding from the weather would be of little use to anyone else, and she was bloody determined to save someone from the horrors of Culloden. Anyone. After 3 hours of walking and then some, she perched on a low stone wall and rested. The spring water she had stored in a wine skin wet her dry mouth and soothed her throat. A bun quietened her stomach. If she walked at a steady, quick pace, she expected to reach Bowley Firth by mid-afternoon. If she found a boat quickly, she could be in Inverness by sundown. She could easily afford to let a room for the night. After all, the coins in her pocket wouldn't need to last her beyond the next day. Either she would fall at Culloden once again, or Sonny would come for her. But what if I've changed my history? She shook her head. Saving herself would be a vain and worthless triumph. She'd been given a pair of days. Surviving the massacre would not buy her more time. But if I never fell at Culloden, I wouldn't have become one of the 79, so...
Easy there, lassie.
Across the road and down a bit, a young man dressed in rags separated himself from the trees. She'd been so lost in thought she hadn't noticed him.
Easy now. Dinna stand on my account, aye.
He held his empty hands out to his sides and took small, slow steps toward her.
I pray ye willna mind sharing your luck with me. Your sack seems full and heavy, and I'm ever so willing to lighten your load.
She lifted one boot and slid a wicked, narrow blade from a sheath she had sewn inside. And while she held it up between them, she lowered her sack behind the wall and shook the handle of another dagger out of her sleeve. One quick move later, and both hands were full and ready for a fight. The man stopped 5 feet away and grinned. His eyes widened playfully, and he waved his hands as if he were trying to amuse her.
I've got it,
came a voice from behind her. She swung her left arm wide and spun, hoping to wound the one who'd spoken. But the figure jumped backward. He hadn't completely escaped her reach, however, because the tip of her blade skittered across cloth or something more.
Cor, she cut me!
The second man, dressed better than the first, gaped at the blood on his fingers and the slice across his shirt. Her sack hung from his other hand. With a blade pointed at each man, she wielded the only other weapon she had, self-assurance. With her chin in the air and a cocky grin on her face, she teased them. I suggest, if your bellies are empty, you join an army and earn a meal, aye? Something pressed against her back. Solid, unbending. It could have been a pistol or a knife. Through her coat she couldn't tell. The first man laughed.
Thank you for the suggestion, lassie, but we've just left all that behind us.
Deserters. Dangerous men, then. A startling thought followed. If she'd succeeded in luring her brothers and cousins away from the battle, would others see them as she viewed these men? Chapter 6. Nessa stood her ground and continued to point her blades at the two men she could see. Her coat was thick. Cutting through it with a dull blade would be hard work, but with a sharp one, or a pistol? One chance in 3 then.
Drop your weapons,
growled the man at her back. She shook her head and laughed. I'll be dead tomorrow. I might as well go out fighting. After all, if I kill one of you, perhaps that will save someone you might have killed later on, aye? The reasoning cheered her.
Dead tomorrow?
The man sounded dully perplexed, so she took advantage of his confusion and spun around to face him. Her right blade stopped at his throat, and the one in her left hand pointed at the man in the road. The man still standing on the far side of the rock wall, she would worry about only after he climbed over it. Aye, dead tomorrow, she said gleefully. And who wants to race me to hell,
What's all this talk about death now?
The man in the road shook his hands again. He was trying to distract her, but she wouldn't fall for that a second time. Holding tight to her weapons, she changed positions again and pointed one blade at the man before her, and the other toward the wall. Only that villain had jumped over and reached for her just as she swung her knife. Again, the tip drew across his chest, and though he yelped, he kept coming, knocking her arm behind her and shoving her toward the road, where the first man caught her and forced her arms to her sides. The man in front of her watched without paying attention to the end of his pistol. She assumed he wasn't worried about the dangerous end, because it wasn't loaded. The cut man pressed himself against her right side.
You apologise, princess.
Spittle flew from his mouth. To the man with the pistol, he gestured with his head.
Shoot her, Ben, if she does not apologise.
Ben shuffled closer. Nessa struggled to get her arms loose. With her blade still in hand, she was sure she could extricate herself if she could get but one arm free. But with a man to either side of her, holding tight, she wasn't able to budge. The man raised his pistol to point at her temple.
Ye'd best apologise quickly, I reckon.
She stopped struggling and smiled weakly. Kiss my arse.
Shoot her!
Ben shrugged like he had no choice. With the gun pressed to her head, she clearly heard the hammer fall. A shot rang out. She'd bet the gun wasn't loaded, but she'd apparently lost that wager. Or had she? She felt no pain. Suddenly the men at her side stepped away from her. Ben, staring wide-eyed, tipped to his right and fell. Had his gun misfired? She lifted her weapons to ward off the other two, but they disappeared into the trees where the grubby man had first appeared. From the hill behind the wall, a man rushed towards her and vaulted over the barrier as if it were just another step to take. By the time she recognised him, he was almost upon her. Relief flooded through her and threatened to spill out of her eyes in the form of tears.
Are ye all right, lass?
He said, worrying over her head, turning her face to and fro.
I was afraid I'd never get my best loaded in time, and I was too far away to come running, aye.
Such a welcomed sight. She'd never imagined seeing him again. His rich dark hair was cut above his collar, icy blue eyes narrowed slightly. Ever observant he was. The corners of his eyes were creased from both squinting and laughing overmuch. That much he knew. And his brows matched his beard, a bit on the scraggly side with a thick dark patch in the centre. He might have appeared almost whimsical but for the sobering, heart-stopping face beneath all that hair. And heaven have pity, his body moved like a great sleek cat, smooth on the surface with much going on underneath. Air. She needed more air. After a deep breath, she shook her head, still disbelieving. Gerard Ross? Is it truly you then? And where is son today? He ceased looking her over for possible injuries and frowned.
Aye, I am he. Have we met somewhere before?
It was a fine feeling having him searching her eyes, standing close, speaking low. It was a sensation she had only imagined her last night on Culloden Moor, just before Wickham intruded. But now, in the flesh, she considered it a boon indeed, but a boon she had not yet earned. Come now, Ross, dinna pretend you cannae recognise me. He frowned harder.
Let loose your hair, lassie.
Hadn't he said the same thing on the moor? Any second he would know her. She grinned and pushed her hood back to reveal her thick mane of red curls. There now, you've seen it. What do you think? A mix of amusement and confusion lingered in his eyes, and she blushed and turned away. Neither was the reaction she'd hoped for. But then she blushed again when she realised what she had been hoping, that he would fall truly, madly, deeply in love with her, the moment he had seen her in good light. Unfortunately, that didn't seem likely. She looked over the hillside from whence he'd come, and checked the road in both directions. Where's Sonny? Didn't she come with you? Or Wickham? Ross shook his head.
Nay, lass, I truly believe ye have confused me with another, though I wonder how ye ken my name.
It was her turn to be confused, but it didn't last long. The ghost of Gerard Ross would have known her on sight, after he'd had such a close look at her on the moor, darkness or no. But Gerard Ross, the man, wouldn't know her from Adam. Forgive me, she said. The men who accosted me. I can't think clearly at the moment. For effect, she put her hand to her forehead and stumbled, pretending. Ross grabbed one of her hands, wrapped an arm around her waist, and led her back to the wall.
'Tis no wonder, lass. You must have been frightened for your life, though I've never seen a woman tell her firing squad to kiss her arse.
The mention of a firing squad summoned the memory of the battle, and the massacre that followed. And that inspiration she'd been hoping for shone down on her like a spotlight from heaven. Maybe she couldn't save her kin. Perhaps she needn't save herself. But if she made enough changes to Gerard Ross's original plans, she could at least save him. Chapter 7. Gerard gazed at the woman before him and thanked God he'd been able to help her. When he'd crested the hill and seen the standoff, he'd hoped the trio would simply take the woman's sack and be on their way. Whatever she had inside couldn't have been as valuable as her life, and could likely be replaced. After all her clothing proved, she was no peasant, which is probably why she'd been accosted in the first place. A pity she hadn't been more accommodating, that might have even left her with her virtue. Now he was simply grateful he'd had the time to load his weapon and fire before she suggested her way into a grave. If he hadn't been drilling for months, cutting down the time it took to load his weapon, he might have been too late. He'd been so shocked by her defiance, he might have missed his target had he allowed himself to laugh. Kiss my arse. What a thing for a woman to say.
I would have your name, lass.
She nodded. Asa.
And your surname?
She shrugged. Asa should do for now. He nodded and offered her a drink from his flask. She smiled and took it, then choked on the contents. I expected water, she whispered, still catching her breath.
Water won't keep me warm tonight, lass.
He stopped himself from imagining something that would. Her head of curls bobbed up and down, and she handed the flask back to him. It had to be said.
It is folly to travel alone, Asa.
I know it, she said. But I doubt the mail coach would take me to the battlefield, eh?
Battlefield?
She shook her head. Forgive me. I am bound for Moor. My brother has run off to join the fight, along with our cousins. I was determined to drag him back home again before he gets killed.
You've changed your mind?
Tears gathered in her eyes and spilled onto her cheeks. You'll never listen to me, she whispered. I follow him in vain. She shrugged and looked away for a moment. You're headed that way yourself?
I am for Inverness, for word of the regiments, just as soon as I've left a wee offering at the well.
She grinned. For the fairies?
Aye.
May I come along? He considered, then nodded.
I vow I will keep you safe, lass, as long as our paths are the same.
She grinned up at him, and her charming face dimpled in 6 places. And I vow I will keep ye safe as well, Mr. Ross. Nessa accepted a great deal more aid from the warrior than she honestly needed. She might have climbed to the top of the rise on her own, but neither of them would know for sure. Once they reached the small peak, they found the source of the wee spring halfway down the face of the other side.
This is Clooty Well.
And this is the fairy hill? He nodded.
From all around the region, folks bring an offering for the fairies to ensure clean water, a good harvest, or the recovered health of a loved one. Any offering will do, though it is common knowledge that fairies love shiny things. A broken bit of mirror, a pretty ribbon, a button.
The hillside was littered with all manner of tokens. Bits of cloth, large and small, had been tied onto every branch of every tree, even the roots that inched up out of the earth. Though she'd heard of the place, it was far more enchanting than she had imagined. It's a marvellous thing, is it not? She said, that no one steals the prettiest things away. Just then, they both noticed a large piece of rotting cloth, half absorbed into the ground itself. If it had once had colour, it was long gone. They laughed in unison. No one would keep a sober face when that man laughed. Mortals and ghosties alike. She had heard it 1,000 times from across the moor, and been comforted to know that a spirit could still know joy.
Pretty things don't last long out of doors in the Highlands. But nay, I suppose few are foolish enough to tempt a fairy's wrath, whether or not they are true believers.
True believers? It was a term used often for those who raised funds and forces for the Jacobite cause, and the true believers were about to be handed their hats. Perhaps it was the fairy hill that inspired her again, but she suddenly knew what had to be done. She pulled her mother's ring from her finger and slid it onto a young green branch. For Jackie, she whispered. She knew the truth in her heart, that this was the last thing she could do for her brother. She could spend her last days searching in vain for a brother that would never listen, or she could put that time to good use and save someone she could actually get her hands on. Choking back her tears, she kissed her fingers and touched the ring one last time, then turned to consider the man standing beside her, setting out his gifts for the fairies, no doubt to win favour in the conflicts to come. This man, she vowed, would not be slaughtered on Moor. On the morrow, not while there was breath left in her. She understood her duty now, and she was going to save him, even if she had to tell him the truth, whether or not he became a true believer in a witch named Sansaray. Chapter 8. Gerard stared at the lass longer than he should, and the pair of them blushed, but he couldn't help himself. There was something strangely familiar about the woman, even though he was sure they'd never met before. So how could that be? And how did she know his name? Was she regretting the slip, hoping he would forget? There was nothing familiar about her voice, to be sure. Nothing familiar about the way she spoke to the vagabonds either. It was a fact that few women, and not many men, would have been so defiant in the face of danger. Foolish, certainly, and she was keeping more than her last name from him. Why had she said she would die soon? Bravado? He hoped so. In truth, he had no more time to dally on a fairy hill and tease answers from her. And if he stared at her any longer, he might forget his purpose altogether.
Come, lass, we mustn't dally. Those deserters might return for their friend's body, and we should be well away from here.
Back on the road, they set off at a goodly pace. Just above Munlochy, they turned south toward Bowley Firth. The way was much smoother then, and he finally hoped to get some answers. Some mysteries between them could not be ignored. For instance, when they were climbing the fairy hill. He'd offered his hand, and after a brief hesitation she took it. The touch of her fingers against his felt like a treat he'd longed for, and the rush of emotion that accompanied that touch could not be explained, at least not by him. Would that intense satisfaction dissolve if examined too closely? Or had his life simply been devoid of females for too long? He didn't think so, but neither could he think of a way to ask her about the emotions she evoked in him. She would think him mad. He cleared his throat.
Lass, 'tis time ye told me how ye ken my name.
Your name?
Aye, ye called me by my name when first ye caught sight of me, and dinna deny it.
She offered a pitiable smile. It's a long story.
It's a long road.
She released a heavy sigh. Do you have many relations by the same name, perhaps?
Nay, lass, give up the game. You've seen me before, though I've never seen you. I will know why.
She bit her lower lip for a good while, and just when he was about to chide her, she finally loosed her tongue. What would you say if I told you we have met before, but in a dream? At first he was perturbed at being put off yet again, when he truly wished to know the truth. But after a breath or two, he had the strangest impression that what she said was true, for her own familiarity seemed like it came from something not quite real. But he wasn't about to spout such nonsense to her, a stranger, and in spite of the magic he felt in her touch, he could not trust her. At the moment, no one in Scotland could be trusted unless they had openly declared their politics, and even then, he would trust no man until they fought shoulder to shoulder with him. As for women, well, women weren't to be trusted at all where politics were concerned, especially one who would not identify her clan. But on the subject of otherworldly matters? He shook his head. No, he would trust nothing, especially when they were still so near the fairy hill. That was the answer. The fairy hill. Perhaps she was a fairy in woman form, come to tempt him away from the battle. Or the pair of them were being used by some magical creature for its own entertainment. He nearly laughed at the idea, but decided sobriety was best and lowered his brow.
Nay, lassie, I'll not believe it. I suggest ye give me the truth. After coming to your aid, ye owe me that, I would say.
She nodded. You're right. I do owe you the truth. But, like I said before, it is a terribly long tale to tell, and I couldn't possibly be expected to tell it and walk at the same time, If you'll escort me back home, I promise to feed you well while you listen to my story. And I am a fine cook, if I do say so myself. He stopped and faced her, trying to intimidate her with a fierce look.
Ye mean to tempt me away from my duty, then, like some nymph from the well itself?
She feigned innocence, and did it so quickly enough to prove her guilt. Nay, sir, I am no temptress, but I do wish to thank you for coming to my rescue. And since those blackguards took my sack, I have nothing with which to reward you. His gaze dropped to her mouth, with thoughts of being rewarded with a simple kiss, perhaps two. But he still couldn't trust her enough to close his eyes and enjoy it in the first place.
And I suppose ye live west of here?
He asked, with only mild sarcasm. Her eyes lit with what could only be hope. Aye, just a mite.
Oh? Muir of Ord, perhaps.
Nay, just in Dingwall. He barked with laughter. Dingwall was, in fact, further away than Ord. It would take them hours to reach the town, and hours to return, no closer to Inverness and his duty than they were at that moment. In answer, he took a step back and turned down the road again toward the firth. If the lass had much care for her person, she would come along. Her original destination meant she had to cross Kessock, the same as he. Why change her course now? If her brother had gone in search of Charles Stuart's army, and she truly sought her brother, returning to the west made no sense at all, unless there was no brother, and her goal all the while had been to lure him away from his regiment. He was disgusted with himself for not thinking of it straight away. But then again, the lass was comely, her voice compelling, her bravado captivating. Heaven help him, he was a fool. Obviously, the three who attacked the lass were cohorts, and this Asa, whomever she was, had been commissioned to lure officers like himself away from their regiments. Oh, how close he'd come to believing there might be something remarkable between them. How foolish he'd been not to ask her from the beginning how she'd known his name. And that excitement he'd felt when their fingers first touched. A man's simple reaction to the attention of a pretty lass. A man who had spent far too much time in the company of soldiers since summer last. He walked on, his ears strained for the sound of the clever woman's footsteps behind him, but they never came. How foolish, he realised, to turn his back on the enemy. Before he'd finished the thought, he spun on his heel and pulled his sword free. But neither the lass nor the cohorts followed him. The only person on the road besides himself was the woman, lying in a heap on the ground. Chapter 9. A cursory scan of the surrounding shrubbery and trees revealed no sign of the villains. So he bent over the lass, all the while keeping a wary eye on her hands. If she'd fainted in truth, he'd be greatly surprised.
Lass, what is it?
She showed no response, but her breathing was fairly normal and there was no sign of blood. If she'd been wounded, there would have been blood.
I'll not carry you home, no matter what your complaint, and I'll not wait half the day for you to rise either if that was your hope. You can do as you please, but I'm off. I'd suggest you dunna lay about on the ground for long. Beasts will find ye. 4 legs or 2, they will find ye.
And with that he straightened and walked away again, only he did so backward to watch for her reaction. She rolled her head to the side and peeked with one eye.
Aha!
He stopped and pointed. She sat upright and glared. I can't believe you would leave a woman lying on the ground, Ross.
And I canna believe you would lie down on the ground to tempt a man to forget his duty and his principles.
Her eyes widened and she blushed. Obviously she hadn't thought through the consequences of her little charade. He took pity on her and returned to help her to her feet. She brushed the dirt from the back of her skirts and watched him warily, as if it had been his suggestion that she invite unwelcome attention.
Dinna think it, lass.
Standing face to face, however, brought on another wave of elusive emotions, like the memory of a powerful dream that had caused him to wake on the verge of weeping. What was it about the lass that could bring him up short like that, when he was absolutely certain he'd never met her before? The fairy answer seemed obvious but irrational. In spite of visiting the fairy hill many times out of respect for the traditions of his forefathers, he still couldn't believe the lass was somehow a fairy in human form. But what else could it be? Witchcraft? The woman winced, and Gerard realised he'd whispered the word aloud. He lent about as much credence to witches as to fairies, but for some reason, the idea made his bones tingle beneath his skin. God help me. The woman recoiled. Why would you say such a thing to me? He shook his head briskly.
Pay me no heed, lass. My mind wandered is all.
He glanced over his shoulder.
What's it to be then? Will ye share the road with me to Inverness, or do we part ways now?
She huffed. obviously none too pleased with the choices offered. "I'll share the road." Her grumbled words were clear enough, and they started down the road once again. Her capitulation made him suspicious, however. Was she touched in the head? If she wasn't the enemy, wasn't in league with the three villains, why was she still determined that they stay together? Nothing of what she'd said or done made sense to him. Nothing was simple, that was for certain. The villains were not close on their heels. He would have sensed them, if not seen them by now. He watched her circumspectly as they travelled in silence, just as she watched him. But what was she watching for? Recognition? Did she suffer from the same waves of mysterious emotion each time they touched? Or stood too close? Was she determined to solve the mystery? Or did she already hold the answer and waited for him to understand it? Was she truly his enemy? Doubtful. He had no proof either for or against. A Jezebel? Definitely not. She seemed genuinely innocent. A fairy? No. A witch? He doubted witches were offended by the accusation. Flattered, more likely. Could she be who she claimed to be? The sister of a young lad who had run off to war too young? Surely not. If she were in such pursuit, why would she be so willing to turn around to lead Gerard west again? To fix him a fine meal and tell him the whole of her tale? He was back to the start again, wondering what the lass's secrets were and how he might entice her to reveal them.
"I don't suppose,"
he said, finally breaking the silence,
"that you would consider telling me this long story of yours if we simply walked a bit slower."
She laughed, and he was delighted she could easily do so. "In truth, Mr. Ross, my hesitation comes not from my lack of stamina, but yours." He nearly tripped, but caught himself, then laughed at the irony of her questioning his ability to stay on his feet.
"A coincidence only,"
he assured her. She understood and laughed again.
"I have a friend who lives just across the firth. If ye have no other arrangements, we can stop there, tuck in some supper, and ye can tell me the story."
The offer cheered the lass, and she willingly quickened her pace, which only made him wonder all the more. However, the plan fermenting in his mind made her secrets irrelevant. For once they reached Jean Eve's home, he would make certain the lass was safely confined before he left her behind. Chapter 10. Nessa was pleased with the way things were working to her advantage. It had been foolish, truly, to pretend to have fainted when Ross had refused to go west with her, and when he showed her how vulnerable she'd been. The thought sent chills up her spine and into her hair, and she shivered. Though Ross had implied both man and beast would find her and take advantage of the situation, she was certain he had been much more worried about the two-legged kind, as was she now. But that foolishness was behind them, and even if he'd refused to travel west, her intention to keep him from Culloden was still intact. All she needed to do once they arrived at his friend's home was to keep him there until midday, on the morrow. By then, word will have spread about the massacre, and he could spend his afternoon hiding from Hanoverians instead of lying in a bog of mud and blood and waiting to rise again with the sun to become one of the 79. She could hardly wait to cross the firth. She was also eager to get the man in a room and hold him hostage there. It would give her a chance to make up for nearly 270 years of avoiding his notice. And if there was one good thing that had come from her tying up her brother in the barn, it was that she now knew to take much more care with her knots. All the way to the coast, Nessa and her handsome Highlander played a game. For long stretches at a time they said nothing at all. Then all at once he would offer a comment designed to ferret out her secrets. She would take a moment to consider a careful response, then they'd laugh. It was very much like dancing. And the more they played, the more they smiled at one another. And the more they smiled at one another, the more anxious she was to change his history.
"You still mean to drag your brother home again, or is it a cousin?"
She shrugged. I have both brothers and cousins, sir. He frowned, unsatisfied.
Do you believe Prince Charlie to be as bonny as they say?
I've never seen the man.
What does your mother think of you running off alone?
My mother thinks nothing of it. That surprised him.
She doesn't know. Did you leave a misleading letter?
My mother is lying peacefully in her grave, she said. At least, I hope she is peaceful.
I'm sorry, lass.
He caught her swinging hand and gave it a squeeze. Then he didn't release it again. She pretended not to notice.
And your father?
Yes, she smiled. I have a father. No, he will not skelp me for leaving home.
And your home is in Dingwall, you say?
Recently, yes, and I was raised there. Let him unravel that.
So you've returned recently. From whence?
From, dare she say it? From Culloden. He frowned and rolled the word around on his tongue a few times.
Culloden. Culloden.
Northeast of Inverness. He nodded, still deep in thought.
Are you married, then?
Their hands ceased swinging, but he had yet to let go. Nay, I never married.
Yet to marry, you mean?
He gave her a wink. She shrugged. There was no use arguing with the man. It would reveal too much.
Aha. I just now remembered what you said to those blackguards, that you didn't expect to live much longer. What could ye have meant, I wonder?
He studied her carefully. She'd forgotten she'd said it. That is part of my long tale. He stopped and pulled her closer, then took hold of her other hand as well.
Deny it, lass. Deny it now.
She laughed to dispel his worry, but it didn't work. He still frowned. She tried again. I was in a spot, wasn't I? 3 men, and me with 2 blades. I had to frighten them somehow. And nothing is more frightening than someone with nothing to lose, eh? He looked back and forth, searching her eyes, then finally relented.
I suppose, but what has that to do with your tale?
She shook her second hand free and started walking again. Dinna worry. I'll find a way to weave it in. His head turned sharply. Then he barked with laughter. He swung her around to face him a second time and stepped close. She continued walking backward while he stalked her, grinning. Then he stepped on the tip of her boot intentionally and caught her before she fell back. Their chilled faces were stiff with cold, and she was sure her nose and ears were tipped with pink just as his were. But for a moment, the heat rising from their bodies mingled and created a warm cloud. The way his head dipped toward her seemed the most natural thing in the world, as did the way her head tilted to the side so their noses didn't collide. His lips were warm enough to thaw her own, and they stayed there, pressed against hers, reminding her what it meant to be alive, warm and connected to another mortal. He kissed her over and over again, always gentle, always warm, until she lost track of how much time had passed. In fact, she lost track of all kinds of things. He pulled back and gave her a wink.
Forgive me, Asa. I know not what came over me.
She smiled and wrinkled her nose, already missing his heat. Forgiven? This time, when they set out again, he stuffed both hands in his pockets. So she wrapped her scarf around her face and pulled her hood forward to hide any hint of disappointment. She slipped her hands in her pockets as well. A long, quiet hour passed before the smell of the North Sea seeped through her scarf. 15 minutes later, they arrived at the point. When they walked out onto the dock, Gerard did the strangest thing. He looked behind them, as if he expected someone to be following. After a brief glance at her, he took her hand again and led her to the large boat waiting to ferry 24 souls across the Firth to Inverness.
The Keswick Ferry. Lucky we're crossing so late in the day, otherwise we'd need to fight the pigs for space.
Chapter 11. Gerard worked his way toward the bow of the large boat and dragged his companion along behind. Companion. And a female companion at that. Now that he was holding her hand again, flesh to flesh, as it were, he was back to experiencing those strange emotions. They'd been so overpowering on the road. He'd stuffed his hands into his pockets on the pretense of keeping them warm. But in truth, he'd needed to step away from the strange spell cast over him by the feel of her. Like a hungry man who'd overfed himself at a grand feast, he'd needed time to let his innards settle. When they reached Kissock, however, he had been struck by an urgent need to keep the lass close, so she didn't slip away from him. A damned nuisance, that. After all, it was he who planned to slip away from her once they reached Jean Eve's home. And if they did much more touching, he would have a difficult time walking away. There was no question he would rejoin the prince's forces, wherever they were gathering. The only uncertainty was how painful it might be to leave the lass behind. He supposed when it was over, perhaps in the fall, he would go to Dingwall and see if she'd told the truth. Or perhaps he would search near Culloden. But he didn't waste time denying that he would, indeed, look for her again. When he found her, though, would she forgive him? She was a stubborn lass, to be sure, and weren't stubborn lasses more likely to hold their grudges with tight fists?
Perhaps I need to plant a few seeds of forgiveness in her mind now.
They faced the spectre of Inverness looming beyond the fog. Jammed tightly between other travellers, their shoulders pressed together, it was an easy thing to turn and force her to face him.
Asa.
Her brows puckered for a heartbeat, then smoothed, as if she hadn't recognised her name. Yes?
You were quick to forgive me, back on the road.
She frowned again. Forgive you?
Aye.
And before she had time to guess what he was about, he lowered his head to hers and nudged her chin up with a gentle touch. If she was surprised by his kiss, he couldn't tell, for his own eyes closed in anticipation of another sweet embrace.
Lovely,
he whispered against her lips and pressed in again. A gentle touch of her hand on his chest was half-hearted at best, more like she leaned into him for support. But when she did push away in earnest, he stepped back.
Forgive me.
She pulled a deep breath into her lungs and finally smiled. What, again? He laughed at her teasing.
Aye, again.
She forced a frown and failed to appear stern, but he played along. I think it would be foolish of me to forgive you so quickly this time. I wouldn't want you spoilt.
Just as long as you want me,
he said in his mind. Aloud he said,
Very well. Hold on to your forgiveness until I ask for it again, aye.
She laughed. Like a pebble in my pocket?
Aye.
He searched her golden brown eyes, but found no hint of suspicion.
Like a pebble in your pocket.
Then he remembered.
In fact,
he unlatched his sporran, pulled a small white pebble he'd been carrying with him, for luck, since the last time he'd walked along the beach of Rosemarkie. He'd seen the translucent white stone just before he spotted 2 whales in the bay, and deemed it a talisman.
Here you are,
he said, and pressed the stone into her open palm.
For good fortune.
Her admiration for the pretty pebble was brief, and she tried to give it back. I will not take your luck, Gerard Ross. Chills raced up and down his spine at the sound of his name on her tongue once again. He pushed her hand away and touched his lips.
I've got fresh luck now, lassie. Dinna fash o'er me.
Eventually, she nodded and slipped the pebble into her coat pocket, then patted it. A pebble of forgiveness, then, until you ask to have it back. He tapped her on the nose instead of kissing her again, like he was tempted to do.
Nay, lass, not a pebble of forgiveness, a pocketful. I'm sure I'll need at least that.
Her smile was a good sign that she'd mistaken his meaning, as he'd intended. Hopefully she thought he planned a generous number of kisses to warrant that much forgiveness, instead of the blanket of absolution he would later need for leaving her captive at Jane Eve's home. Unfortunately, Jane Eves was not at home, and neither were his servants. Chapter 12. The golden-brown cobblestone streets of Inverness appeared new and shiny in the incessant spring rain. The slope leading up from the quay to the centre of town was wet, but the stones gripped their boots and their footing was sure. But just in case, Nessa held tight to Gerard's arm. His free hand gripped the end of his plaid over the top of his capped head and shoulders. Her own cloak was protection enough for her. A turn to the right and another slope led up to the castle. The rain and wind made it inconvenient to converse, so Nessa didn't bother asking where his friend lived. She only knew that they were headed away from Culloden for the moment, and for the moment that was enough to change their very stars. That other her had faded from her kitchen, and for all Nessa knew, from the world as well. So if she were the only Nessa Kennedy walking about, there would be no Nessa Kennedy on Culloden's Moor tomorrow, and she was glad she wouldn't be there to witness the hopeless, hapless debacle. All she had to do was keep her feet and Gerard's firmly planted in the city. They hurried up the hill, and without so much as a glance at the red stone castle as they passed, Ross urged her on. They'd not gone more than 100 steps further than the castle wall, when they passed a massive stone wall on the left. Gerard paused at a gate in the centre of it, a gate Nessa would have passed and never noticed. A small plate was attached to the iron bars in the middle. Dunvegan. After Gerard turned a handle and lifted the gate slightly, it swung open. He acted nonchalant, but she was close enough to note the nervous flash of his eyes as he gave the street one last glance. He then took a hold of her elbow and helped her up a flight of stone steps that brought them out into a small courtyard filled with flowers. Though it was still cold in April, some of the blue and yellow blossoms had already begun to bloom. They strolled along the front of the house that faced the street far below. He knocked lightly on a door set back in the centre, but there was no cover, so they stayed beneath the drape of plaid and hood, while they waited for someone to allow them inside. No one answered. Gerard used the knocker. The heavy metal on metal rang through the splash of the rain, like 3 gunshots. He worried his lip with his teeth. After a long moment more, he finally gave up hope.
Come.
He led her around the side of the house where they looked through the large French windows of the dining room. No fire, no lanterns. Only the natural light of the gloomy afternoon made it possible to see the furniture.
Everything looks in order.
She kept quiet and tried not to add to his worry while he led her around the back of the house and another set of steps that led up to the next plateau of the hillside. A modest but well-kept barn stood at the back of the rise. Gerard forced a sedate pace while they walked through the yard to the small door at the side, like he suspected someone was watching. She held her breath while he reached for the handle, then let it out in a rush when the door swung open with ease. Finally, they were able to step inside. Fresh straw covered the floor, but it was soon soiled with mud from their shoes and rain dripping from their clothes. Gerard pulled his excess of plaid off to the side and twisted it. The wool relinquished a goodly amount of rain before he spread it out again and draped it over his shoulders. She could have watched him move all day.
Someone is tending to the animals at least. Okay, that would be me.
A bit of straw rained down from the loft and a voice along with it. A sober face leaned over the edge.
Mr. Ross. Aye, Mullins, is it?
The man's face lit.
Aye, it is.
He chucked a rake to the ground and hurried down the ladder. He stretched out his hand to Gerard while tipping his cap to her.
Miss...
He shook his head.
Jean-Yves is gone, I'm afraid.
They'd come to see a Frenchman? Gerard stiffened beside her.
Gone? His brother has been arrested in France, or so he was told. Though he suspects it was a ruse to get him out of the Highlands, he had no choice but to see for himself, aye. Took some servants with him, sent the rest away. 'Tis no time to be in Inverness if there's no need.
Nessa doubted her warrior was aware of it, but he squeezed her hand, his only outward show of just how upset he was by the news. Mullins removed his cap and looked anxiously at her.
Paddy Mullins, at your service.
Gerard nodded.
This is Asa.
She didn't fall for it, didn't offer her last name. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Mullins. The small man hadn't missed the omission either, but he nodded and let it go. Gerard, on the other hand, frowned at her. But her reasons for keeping her name a secret hadn't changed. As soon as she could get him restrained somehow, she would be free to tell him whatever he wished to know. Until then, he could frown until the Highland coos came home. The idea of tying him up and having him at her mercy did strange things to her insides. And that feeling of butterflies winging around in her stomach turned into a loud, rather sharp growl. The men looked at her middle, then at her face, and laughed quietly.
I've the key to the house. No doubt there's a morsel or two in the larder, and I'm happy to clean a chicken for ye.
Jean Ives' home was an elegant but small manor, situated high above the street. There was little to the front garden, perhaps only 5 feet in total from the facade of the house to the wrought iron fence that topped the high stone wall holding the hill in place. On the side opposite the flower garden and fruit trees, there were only 2 feet between the house and the wall, and a sheer drop of nearly 30 feet to the small alley below. The height, however, afforded a breathtaking view from the upper floor windows. 3 large bedrooms, a bathing chamber, and a privy closet filled that space, along with a small stairway that presumably led to maids' quarters in the attic. There were 5 rooms to the main floor of the house. The sitting room and dining room comprised the front half. A small library filled the rear corner with a window onto the wee garden, and the larder sat behind the kitchen with a door that led to the steps and the barn beyond. Nessa found a serviceable gown in the closet of a smaller bedchamber, and changed into it. She then carried her wet things back downstairs. A long closet ran behind the library, where the heat from that fire could dry her clothes, and she had just set about hanging them when Gerard poked his head inside.
I've set a fire in the library, lass, and another in the kitchen stove. We'll stay to the rear of the house and avoid lighting candles, aye.
We can't just pull the curtains? He shook his head.
If anyone is watching the house, they'll know the curtains were left open. If they see smoke from the chimney, hopefully they'll think a servant watches o'er the place. The best way to make someone curious is to hide something from them, aye.
She understood. In a population of opposing alliances, Inverness was a dangerous place. And if Jean Ives was a Jacobite sympathiser, this house wouldn't be a safe haven after 1 o'clock the next afternoon. But until then, she was determined to keep Gerard Ross inside it, no matter what she had to do. Gerard declared he needed to check the parameter, but promised he would be back before supper was ready. With no choice but to trust him, Nessa nodded and let him go. Since the man couldn't read her thoughts, there was no need to run away from her, yet. True to his promise, Paddy delivered a freshly cleaned and plucked chicken to the kitchen. Since they wouldn't be staying too long, Nessa saw no need to boil the bird. So she melted some lard in a heavy pan and set out to fry it. When Gerard left the next afternoon, anything remaining could go in a sack. Soup couldn't travel, and thermoses hadn't yet been invented. By the time he set out, however, her 2 days will have passed, so, wherever he went, he'd be going without her. The point she had to remember was that he would still be alive and able to flee. She made a mental note to mention how well Scots would fare in Canada. Chapter 13. With the chicken laid out in the pan, she partially covered it with a lid and headed back to the larder to find some root vegetables. She was eager to attempt a batch of French fried potatoes and reasoned that good food would keep Gerard distracted for the rest of the evening. If she stuffed him full enough, he might doze, which would give her an opportunity to tie him up without too much fuss. Stuffed into the back of a shelf, She found a gunny sack full of small Irish potatoes and some onions. She could have squealed with delight, but she was trying to keep her emotions at a low keel while Gerard was lurking around the place as prickly as a hedgehog. If only he knew what was about to happen mere miles away from Inverness. Mere hours from now. She stepped quietly out of the larder and stopped to keep the door from making noise. But in her stealth, she heard the low drone of men's voices in the library. Gerard was back, and Mullins with him. She'd thought the smaller man had gone. Would he be staying for supper? She took a step in that direction, but stopped short when she realised Gerard was deliberately keeping his voice low. And since she was the only other body in the house, he had to be saying things he didn't intend for her to hear. So, naturally, she edged closer.
Promise me you'll keep her safe if this clash goes Cumberland's way. I cannot say for certain which side she favours, if any at all, but I do not want her harmed, spy or no.
He thought her a spy for Cumberland. Was he out of his mind?
Aye, sir, I promise. And you understand, if she is a spy, that I cannot allow her out of this house. Aye, I regret I cannot stay. The lads said they are gathering near Moor, and I must join them before morning. I need you to find a horse for me. Not so easy a task. Whatever you have to pay, just have it in the barn by midnight. Aye, sir. Collect the lass in the morning. I dinna ken where I'll put her. I'll find her, sir. No worries. You're a good man, Mullins. When this is over, dinna fash o'er me, sir. Godspeed.
Nessa crept back into the kitchen and set about washing the vegetables. There was no rush. She had until midnight to contain a large, powerful, nervous Highlander who actually believed he could leave, and leave her behind. A pocket full of forgiveness might not be enough to satisfy her now. Gerard stuck his head into the kitchen and found the lass slicing onions. Tears dampened her cheeks, and he chuckled.
It's a lucky thing I noticed your onions, lass, or I might have thought I was the one to make you great.
She waved him away with her knife. Just worried for my brother and cousins, is all.
Oh, aye.
He'd nearly forgotten about the brother, who had supposedly gone off to fight with the Jacobites. Or had she ever mentioned which side he'd be fighting for?
I am sorry, lass.
She waved him away again.
Do you have need of anything?
She shook her head and didn't look at him.
Then I'll pop upstairs and see if I can find some dry things as well. The chicken smells tantalising, truly.
She nodded slightly.
All right then. Dinna go anywhere.
He forced a laugh, but she didn't seem to see his humour. No matter, though, as long as she obeyed him. Upstairs he found some fine things his friend had left behind. The black trews were snug to his legs, but they were dry. And to keep them from revealing too much of him to the innocent lass cooking his supper, he donned a green silk shirt with long, generous tails. His feet had to remain bare, for there was not a dry slipper in the house that could fit his large feet. In the small closet off the library, he hung his plaid next to her gown and turned her clothes over to dry the other side. Just touching them gave him that same strange sense of the familiar, and he was beginning to get angry about it all. Why was he so distracted by the cause that he couldn't remember where he'd seen her before? Was he losing his wits? The one person who could help him wasn't far. He only hoped that, once they finally sat down together, she would finally tell him her tale. She'd claimed it was a long story, but no matter. He only needed her to finish the telling of it by midnight. Long before the strike of 12, however, he hoped she would be sleeping soundly, behind lock and key. He padded into the kitchen to show off his finery, but the lass was not there. The pan of tempting chicken had been set to the back of the stove. A platter of delicious-looking potatoes waited on the cupboard. But Asa was gone. His heart began pounding, urging him to move quickly. The library was empty. While he'd been petting her clothes like a fool, had she gone back upstairs? He took the steps 3 at a time and pulled on the railing to help him along. Not in the bedchambers. He edged carefully up to the window in the largest room. She was not below on the street, not in the side garden. He hurried to the door of the privy chamber and knocked. The door swung open, empty. He chided himself as he hurried down the steps again.
Fool, she is preparing a meal. No doubt she was inside the larder, and is likely back in the kitchen.
But she wasn't. There was barely enough light to see into the back room, but the floor was clear. Unless she had tucked herself onto a dark shelf, she'd been and gone. He felt the fool, checking the library once more before looking in the kitchen again. Out of breath from more than just exertion, and ready to laugh at himself, he stepped through the doorway with a quip on his tongue. But the chicken still waited quietly.
Asa!
He hissed at the foot of the stairs, then moved carefully through the dim hallway to the front of the house.
Lass, where are ye? She's here,
said a calm, male voice. Seated on the couch with his back to the door was a blond man, with his hair secured behind his head with a dark bow. He turned his head slightly, smiled at Gerard, then stood. The red of his thigh-long red coat was still easy to see in the light of the western sky, coming through the large sitting-room windows.
Forgive me, Sergeant Colville at your service.
His weapons were in the closet, with his wet clothes. He hadn't so much as a dagger in his boot. He had no boots. Asa jumped up from a chair in the far corner and hurried toward him with a forced smile on her face and warning lift of her brow. Sergeant Colville, allow me to introduce my bridegroom, Bennett Ross. She wrapped her hands firmly around his upper arm and squeezed. Bennett, this is Sergeant Colville, and Private Simple is the one trying to start a fire for us. She patted his chest. I'm sorry, husband, but I had to confess everything to the sergeant. We haven't been as stealthy as I thought. She laughed lightly and dragged Gerard around to the chair she'd vacated, urged him to sit, then stood behind him with a hand on his shoulder to hold him down. Colville resumed his seat on the couch.
Yes, your wife explained. I'm pleased to discover you're not a couple of Jacobite supporters.
She laughed lightly and tapped his arm. I told him that is precisely who we're hiding from, that your father was none too pleased you married a Campbell and sent us from his house. I also told him how we had planned to spend our honeymoon in Inverness, but when we heard old Jean Eves was rooted from the town, we jumped at the chance to hide out here, in case Dunvegan becomes available.
It's not the lass's fault. Please remember that,
Gerard said carefully. The sergeant's face flared orange in the light of the fire, newly caught.
Dinna fash, Mr. Ross. I'm mad at myself. I ken just how tempting it is to make a wife happy, and I'm certain that when the Duke is victorious, he'll be happy to have more supporters in Inverness, no matter how they came by their new homes, aye.
Gerard nodded, barely able to contain his disdain for the traitorous Scot. Did he not know that his leader would have no more respect for him than he had had for the Jacobites? That he and Sempill were hated by the very man they served? The private moved around the room, lighting sconces. He returned his smoking reed to the fire, turned, and was immediately alarmed. Gerard recognised him and jumped to his feet to shield Asa, as the man pulled his weapon from his hip and aimed it at Gerard's heart.
Sergeant, this man was at Preston Pans,
said the private.
I would ken him anywhere.
Colville was on his feet as well, arms poised for a fight. Preston Pans? Asa chided, and forced her way between them all. You must be mistaken. Bennett's been wooing me every day since last June. No doubt it was his brother Gerard you faced in Preston Pans. He's the second son you ken. Bennett here is the fourth. It was either me or the clergy for him, but I took pity. She looked at him and sighed dramatically, then nudged him back to the chair. Sending him to the kirk would be a great waste, would it no? The sergeant glared at the soldier.
What do you say, Simple? Is it possible you're mistaking this man for a brother?
The private shook his head at Gerard, his eyes narrow.
If so, the resemblance is remarkable.
Gerard tried his damnedest to appear innocent while plotting the murder of both men. Okay, Asa said. All four Rosses could be twins, in the right light. With the effort she'd put into her performance, it was the least Gerard could do to play along, so, against his instincts, he took his seat again and patted her hand.
She assures me I'm the most handsome of them all, of course.
The sergeant laughed. The private returned his gun to its holster, but his frown never completely cleared from his brow. Every now and then he would sneak a long look at Gerard and frown harder. I invited the two to share our meal, husband, but it seems they've already had their supper. Colville clicked his heels together.
And now that I know the house has not fallen to riffraff, I can rejoin my company. There is bound to be a battle to remember in the next day or two. No doubt you will wish I would have pressed you into service tonight, Ross, so you hadn't missed it.
But you promised, Sergeant, Asa said with a pout. And it's only our second night married. The man had the decency to blush. He gestured for his man to go ahead, then turned back.
A very happy marriage to ye, Gerard Ross, and to your Campbell bride.
Gerard was careful not to blink.
Nay, sir, 'tis Bennett.
The man grinned.
Och, so it is, so it is.
After another click of his heels and a slight bow, the man was gone. Gerard closed the door gently and turned, preparing to start his own interrogation of the Campbell lass, but found her crumpled to the floor in a puddle of velvet robes. Chapter 14. Nessa woke to the cold touch of a wet cloth on her brow. She was lying on a chaise longue in the library. The fire crackled off to her right and she faced the window onto the garden, where only a few yellow blossoms were now visible in the darkness. The large shadowy form of Gerard sat beside her hip as he peered closely at her now open eyes.
You give me a scare. I thought you were play-acting again. Now smile sweetly for the bastards who are no doubt watching through the windows.
She did as he ordered.
Now, I'm going to kiss ye, and ye'll keep on smiling. But no, it is only for our audience, and it is your own fault for telling them that we're newly wed, aye.
Aye. She had to force the smile to remain on her lips, for it was a fact she didn't like the idea of him kissing her when he didn't wish to. He leaned forward and pressed his mouth to hers. It wasn't nearly as gentle as his other kisses had been. It was far more impassioned. But that didn't frighten her, as much as the feeling that she was being punished. I believe that is quite enough, sir, she said, flashing her teeth in more of a threat than a smile. When you next kiss me like that, you'll pull back a stump of a tongue, eh? She reached up and stroked the side of his face. An emotion she didn't recognize flitted across his features, and she pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. But it was too late. Whatever her threat had triggered could not be undone. He got to his feet, bent, and scooped her into his arms. He then carried her into the kitchen, and she had to hang onto his neck while he tossed the chicken onto the platter of potatoes. After he propped the platter on her stomach, he pulled a bottle of wine from a cabinet and carried her up the stairs. Once they reached the master bedchamber, he sat the wine on the table, went to the side window, and yanked the curtains closed, one side at a time. With her arms still draped around his neck and her knees over his other arm, he did the same with the window at the front of the house.
There, that should convince them.
Of what? Stumbling about in the darkness, he took the platter from her and set it on the chest of drawers. She screamed when he tossed her away from him. Thankfully, she landed on the bed.
Convince them we're serious about something other than politics, at least.
He bent over a table and struck a flint, then lit an oil lamp and turned the light low. Returning to the chest of drawers, he popped a bit of potato into his mouth and stared at her as if she might be the next thing he sampled. So she scooted back against the headboard and braced herself for a fight. His brows jumped in surprise.
Ho ho! These are tasty.
He plucked up the platter and moved to a chair by the door.
You'd best act quickly, lass, or you might not eat much tonight.
French fried potatoes. A platter of chips had proven more tempting than her. She felt slightly more insulted than relieved. And after another minute of being ignored, she finally stood, but he paid no notice. She took the lamp to the dressing table and sat. He picked up a leg of chicken and gave it his all. She fussed with a comb Jean Eves or his wife had left behind, and finally allowed her gaze to wander to her own reflection in the mirror. Her curls were a bit out of sorts, but if she ever had a day when they remained in order, it would be once in her lifetime. Her face was pleasant enough, no stray marks of red, smooth and pink. Possibly a bit pinker than she was comfortable with, but when her temper was up, her face usually flushed. Her lips were a bit swollen and bruised, but not terribly so. Her robe was close-tight with small ties above the waist. The lower portion consisted of a generous skirt that wrapped around her body once, and half as much again. In truth, it was possibly more modest a costume than her own gown had been. She'd had nothing to be ashamed of when the sergeant and a soldier had barged through the front door. Thankfully, she'd been quick with an explanation and slow to act guilty. It was a talent she might have learned by watching the telly over the shoulders of those mortals at Culloden. No, there was nothing in the mirror that might tempt a man, let alone a braw, handsome Highlander like Gerard Ross, especially when compared to a plate of chips and chicken. The woman in the reflection inched her fingers toward the dangling tail of satin ribbon that held closed the throat of her robe. In a horror of realization, she pulled back her arm and sat upon her hand. A stolen glance proved Gerard had noticed nothing, but the chicken was going the way of the world, and quickly. She strode to the chair and pulled the plate from his unsuspecting hands. After his initial surprise, he smiled and waved the large breast he still held, like the captured flag of the enemy. She sat upon the bed again and ate quickly, hoping to make up for a long day with an empty stomach. Had it only been that morning the 3 vagabonds had stolen her sack? It seemed like so much longer. Gerard appeared at her side with the bottle of wine. He looked meaningfully at the platter. "Fine," she said, with a throat packed with food. "I'll share as well, but I hold the platter."
Done.
He hopped onto the bed, landing with a thud. The thud that followed was the bed falling apart beneath them. She screamed. The pair of them checked both the platter and the bottle, then sighed with relief to find them intact. Then they giggled.
Well, now I'm certain they're convinced.
Chapter 15. He was a fool, sitting in the darkness on a mattress with a lovely spy. Floor or not was a dangerous move. And since the chicken and potatoes had finally landed in his empty stomach, food was no longer his chief temptation. The bottom half of one lovely calf stuck out from the generous folds of her robe, and he was reminded of all her underthings hanging up to dry downstairs. In a trice, he was on his feet and headed for the door, but he stopped just as quickly as he had started. He couldn't run away from her now. In truth, he was shaking in his boots, frightened he might want more from the woman than just a kiss or two, audience or no. He chuckled to himself. What a fool he was. Hours away from battle, a day or two at most, and the prospect that frightened him the greatest was the danger aimed at his heart. He shook the silliness from his head and moved again. Only this time he closed the door, shoved the chair in front of it, and planted his arse in the seat. The manor was small. There was no back stair, no veranda, no escape. She was at his mercy. He refused to be at hers. And while he held her captive, she would tell him the truth. Who was she? Had she singled him out on the road, with or without the help of deserters? And just which side of the war was she on?
The time for potty fingers is over, lass. You'll give me the answers I need, and quickly.
A mischievous smile spread from her lips, up to her eyes, and her face lit with glee. And what if I don't? He shrugged and refused to allow scandalous scenarios to play out in his mind.
Then I suppose you'll die for the cause.
The lass laughed outright at the threat, just as she had on the road when she had suggested to those villains that she would not live long anyway. I'll be dead tomorrow. I might as well go out fighting. Heaven help him, he'd cornered a mad woman. And if he wasn't careful, he might never make it out of Inverness in time to join Charles Stuart's army.
First, lass, let's begin with a simple question. How is it ye ken the name of my father and my younger brother?
Her smile slipped away. He should have been happy to see her sober so quickly, but he wasn't. Perhaps it was the sad look that replaced the smile, but he pressed forward.
Ye know me well, lass. How is that when I ken ye not at all?
She winced. I dunna suppose you'd wait until after we've had a good night's sleep before we continue the conversation. He struck the arms of his chair, his patience gone.
No more of your wheedling, lass. Give me the truth. The time for games is done.
She pushed the platter onto the floor, stood, and began pacing before the fireplace. Each time she moved toward the window, his stomach tightened until finally he had to ask her to stop. She glanced nervously at the window, then willingly moved to a chair and sat. Speaking over the top of a broken bed was awkward, but his gut relaxed. Yes, I know you a bit, she finally admitted. I canna say where, though, and have you believe me?
Please, lass, the truth.
She shrugged. All right then. Some truth. And we'll see how it rests on your stomach, eh?
Some then, to start.
She nodded. I have come from the future version of Scotland. He closed his eyes and shook his head in disappointment.
Ye believe you're a witch then?
Nay, I was sent. Escorted. No, sent is the right word. Sent by witches.
Dinna tell me. Let me guess. 3 sisters who all share one eye.
She narrowed her gaze at him. I know Shakespeare well enough, damn you.
Damn me.
He got to his feet, his emotions near to boiling if he didn't make more room for them.
Damn me.
He glanced at the window and lowered his voice.
Nay, lassie. Damn ye. Damn ye for distracting me as long as ye have. No doubt that was your duty, to keep me from rejoining my army. No doubt you're in cahoots with Sergeant Colville. Perhaps he waits now to ensure I stay put.
A flash of guilt crossed her face, and he groaned with the painful strike to his heart. She jumped to her feet and hurried to him, but he turned away from her.
Nay, lass, leave me be. Your confession stole my breath for a moment is all.
Gerard, she gasped. I've confessed nothing. Dinna leave me. He tried to reconcile the 2 women in the room. The first a spy for the enemy, the second the lass who softened his heart with the very tone of her voice.
Ye are a witch,
he whispered, and moved the chair from the door.
Mullins will come for ye in the morning and make certain you're safe. If ye've any heart at all, you'll not hand the man to his enemies.
Wait! He shook his head and reached for the knob. Gerard, wait! I've come to save you. Please listen to me. I'll tell you all, I swear it. Only dinna go. He turned back.
So you do mean to keep me here?
Only to keep you alive, my love. It took great effort to swallow those words, but heaven help him, they'd been the only words all day that felt good to him. Time might prove him a fool, but he couldn't help savour the sound of the sincerity on her face. No doubt she'd say something to ruin the moment.
How do I not ken ye, lass, and ye ken me well enough to love me?
The smile on her lips might have been the first honest one since they'd met. I've watched you from afar, laddie, for a long, long while. From half a mile away, I would recognise your walk. The way your arms move, the habit you have for petting your beard, eh? She demonstrated and laughed.
You're from Rosemarkie then?
She shook her head. Close by, though. He nodded, satisfied with that at least.
And ye ken my family?
I know of them. I've never met them, but I imagine your father is a great deal like you. He laughed.
Aye, he was.
Was?
Aye, my father died some years back.
She nodded. Aye, that's right. I'd forgotten. He couldn't help feeling his disappointment was about to return. But first, he wanted to hear her call him my love again. As if sensing his need, she strode to him, wrapped her arms around his chest, as though she'd done it 100 times before, and pulled herself into him. I'm very sorry for your feather. His arms fell naturally around her and held. But there was no time for pretending, not that night. Any other, perhaps. But he had only an hour before he had to sneak to the barn, and hopefully find a horse waiting. He wished there was a way to warn Mullins that the house was being watched. But if he or the lass went looking for the man, it would expose him as a Jacobite sympathiser, and Gerard wouldn't risk that. The man had better luck on his own. Besides, a canny fellow like Mullins would already know who watched. At least Gerard had to believe it or sicken with worry.
Tell me,
he said, still holding the woman.
Is your name truly Asa Campbell, as you said?
She pulled away and gave him a withering stare. Me? A Campbell? Are you mad? She turned her head and spit on the floor. He'd seen that sort of reaction to the Campbell name enough to believe her sentiment was true, in spite of her convincing act in front of the redcoats earlier. Even a practiced spy couldn't have been so convincing.
I dinna understand, then, why you wish to keep me from my duty, if you're not a spy for Cumberland.
She tipped her head back and closed her eyes as if she were praying for guidance. When she opened them again, she looked tired as the ages, but her face seemed to clear of all pretences. She looked straight into his eyes. Gerard Ross, she said. Tomorrow at 1 in the afternoon, the final battle will take place between the Jacobites and the Hanoverians. He opened his mouth to speak, but she lifted a hand to silence him. It will be over in minutes, not hours. If you go, you will die, as my brother and cousins will die. I ken them well enough to know I cannot dissuade them. I have already tried. They will not listen. But you... She reached for him, but pulled her hand back to her side. You I can save, if you'll but heed my warning. I cannot say it plainer. I can tell you that the wounded will not be spared. Cumberland will butcher any and all he can get his hands on. And for months to come, Scotland will never be the same. The clans... Emotion choked her, but she fought through the tears in her throat. The clans will be no more. Scots will be scattered to the ends of the earth, and those who dunna flee will be starved out. She faltered, and he grabbed her arms and helped her into the chair by the door. When she didn't speak again, he tried to lighten the mood a bit.
A dire prophecy indeed, lassie. How have you come by such a frightening prediction? No wonder you set out on your own to try and stop it from coming to pass. I would have done the same myself if I believed such a tale.
She sat forward and groped for his hand. Would you? Would you do anything to change that history before it could happen? He shrugged.
What Scot would not, aye?
Then you do understand. He shook his head.
I understand why you've done what you've done. Why you seem to be mad at times and not so mad at others. But lass, I do not believe your prophecy.
But you must. It's true. He shook his head.
There is no way to know that.
She nodded emphatically. There is.
Oh, and how?
Gerard, love, I was there. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. I was cut down by shot, then finished off with a sword. I fought to your left, with Capoch. Ye fought with Clan Ranald. He backed away from her. As surely as the sun would rise, there was danger in believing her.
How do ye ken which regiment I mean to fight with?
He'd never said it aloud to anyone. As I said, I have already watched the battle in my past and in your future. Nothing matters now but this. I was allowed to come back. And why would I be allowed to come back if not to save someone from the massacre? And if you haven't been listening, I've decided that someone is to be Gerard Ross. The last time I hounded my brother all the way to the front line. And still he wouldn't change his mind. He shook his head.
You would rather he'd been a deserter.
I would have rather he'd never enlisted. After the echo of her words died, the pair of them fell silent. The lass's chest rose and fell rapidly but silently, and he couldn't help thinking of her as a cornered wee beastie. He would have to tread lightly. I suggest, Mr. Ross, that you stretch out on the bed and rest. She scooted the chair in front of the door and sat again, then pulled a blade from inside the folds of her robe and held it across her knee. Because you will not be going anywhere until noon tomorrow. After that my time will be spent, and you'll have had a head start. I strongly suggest you set out for Canada. Nova Scotia would be wise.
Flee? When we are so close to winning the throne again? When we are so close to getting our country back, you would have me throw it all over for New Scotland?
She nodded, sober as the dead, mad as the devil, and there was nothing for it but laughter. Chapter 16. How dare he laugh at her? There she was, spending her precious 2 days, trying to save his life, and the son of a... She couldn't believe he was laughing. Her bit of Irish blood rose to the fore, and she very nearly did something she would, no doubt, regret. But there was something else in her blood running alongside her temper, something that bubbled up in her heart at the sight and sound of Gerard Ross laughing himself silly. Damn him anyway. She sucked on her teeth while he wore himself out, and by the time he was finished, he was on his backside on the mattress. That little tableau also did funny things to her blood, and she suddenly felt the stifling heat rising through the floor from the kitchen. But she wasn't about to start fanning herself like some simpering courtesan. All she really needed was to look away, which she did. The clock on the mantel chimed. The sound echoed in her mind and she lost track. 10, she whispered.
11.
The word was like the strike of a gong. He intended to leave her soon. She found him staring at her, and she was glad the room was dark so he couldn't read her every thought. Suddenly the drapes over the front window lit up. Though she was anxious to see what was happening outside, she dared not surrender her position by the door. Gerard crept to the window and peeked around the left edge, then moved to the right and tried again.
Hard to tell. With the pub and the trees in the way, I cannot see the river clearly, but it seems there is a fire on the far shore.
Not an accident, I'm certain, she said. Not this night. He nodded and watched for a long time. Out one side, then the other. Out the side window, then the front again. She knew he was looking for Colville and Sempill. They couldn't trust that the little play they'd put on in the drawing room had been convincing. When the sergeant called him Gerard at the door, it had been more than a test. It was a message.
If they're out there, I canna see them.
If 2 redcoats were keeping watch on the house and the barn, it would be nearly impossible for Gerard to leave, whether or not she guarded the door. If, by some miracle, she and Gerard had been left alone, she was the only thing standing in his way. If the enemy were still standing guard, it would create an entirely new set of problems on the morrow. When news of Cumberland's victory arrived, if not before, there would be nothing stopping the soldiers from entering the house and cutting them down. Nothing stopping them but Gerard Ross, of course. And considering the way he'd taken down 5 men on his own at Culloden, 2 shouldn't be such a challenge, especially if he was expecting their attack. Ross pushed the edge of the curtain back in place and dropped his hand. Then he just stood there, staring into the darkness. She wished she could read his mind. "Gerard, what are you thinking?" He turned his head and smiled sadly.
"I have to go soon."
That's what she was afraid of. But the man had sadly underestimated her. She lifted her chin. "I do have a blade, sir. That says differently." He ignored her outright, still deep in thought. She gasped to get his attention. "I mean to keep you here, laddie. Make no mistake." He nodded.
"And I mean not to hurt ye when I take your weapon."
She chuckled, grateful for the jest. In truth, the tension in the room was stifling as a thick, knotted scarf. "I'll have you know, I stood my ground at Culloden longer than you might think." He pushed away from the window like a weary old man.
"Give it up, lass. I dinna believe your wild tale."
"I dinna give a damn what you believe. Tomorrow, when it proves true, it'll be too late to thank me."
"Too late? Because I'll be dead."
"Nay, but I will. Be gone." The uncertainty of it struck her in the gut and she shrank against the back of the chair again. She had truly seen the last of her family, and the next 12 hours would be the last she would see of the man before her. It would be the last she would taste of chicken or chips. The last she would taste of Gerard Ross. But at least she could go on to what God had waiting for her, with the knowledge that she'd saved the one man she'd loved, once upon a battlefield. He was suddenly there, standing before her, though she couldn't see his face clearly through tears and shadows.
"None of this now."
He took hold of her wrists, paying no mind to the blade she held tight. He moved her around him, sat, then pulled her into his lap.
"Dinna greet, lass. Tell me why you believe ye will die come the morrow."
She bit her lips, determined not to tell him anything about Culloden 79. Because if she was very careful, there would only be 78, and Gerard Ross would be hightailing it for Canada.
"I would know who threatens ye, lass."
He levelled a stern scowl at her. She laughed. "My life will change tomorrow, as with that of every Scot, aye? 'Tis all." His brow lifted.
"Nothing more?"
"Nothing more."
"Vow it."
She nodded once. "I vow it." An easy promise to make. She would change mortal life for the afterlife.
"Good. Now, I would have a kiss from ye before I go."
She carefully wrapped her arms around his neck, still holding the small knife. "You will not go, but I agree to the kiss." His smile was brief, smothered as it was against her lips, and she learned that a passionate, intense kiss that bruised her lips could still be pleasant. In fact, she wondered why they hadn't kissed that way from the beginning. By the time he'd pulled his head back, she was breathing heavily, and embarrassed, she turned her head against her own shoulder. Something slid against her palm, and too late, she realised he'd relieved her of the weapon. She had nothing else with which to sway him but her words. "Nay, love, dinna leave me. I'm frightened." He chuckled and kissed the top of her head.
"My Asa,"
he snorted.
"ye forget, lass, I've heard your take on the 3 armed men and dare them to shoot ye. I cannot believe a little darkness and a wee time alone would bother ye a whit."
"I'm not afraid for me, love. Haven't you listened? I'm afraid for you. Can you not give me a day, just one day, to prove what I say is true? Can you not give me until noon tomorrow to join the others? If what I say is false, then you have no need to hurry away. The battle may not begin for another day or more. Am I wrong?"
"Nay, lass, I slipped out to meet with a messenger. I ken the armies are close to Culloden, to Drumossie, like you say, but ye might have heard it from a messenger of your own, aye."
"I've been with you since this morning. I've seen no one without ya."
"Ye might have had word before we met up. It doesna matter now. I only know that I must go."
and I know just as surely that you must not. Please." She took his head in her hands and tried to convince him with her lips how badly she wanted him to stay. But he resisted.
"Lass,"
he said against her mouth.
"even a practised seduction could not keep me here this night, no matter how strong my feelings for ye."
"You feel strongly for me, then?" She resumed her attack on his lips, but he resisted.
"Aye, lass. I felt it from the first time ye took my hand on the ferry hill. I've fought it all day, but there is no use. In the morning, return to Dingwall, and I will come for ye when there is a Stuart on the throne, or when the cause is lost. I swear it."
"Nay, kiss me."
"I will not, lass. I cannot."
Tears burst from her eyes. "Why can you not stay out of this one battle? Just this one?" He considered for a moment.
"Ye say ye ken the future. Ye ken that I will die if I go.
"Aye, I know it."
Ye say ye saw me. Did I fight well?"
Even though he didn't believe it, he dreaded the news that he hadn't. She looked down. "What does it matter?"
"Tell me."
"Aye, of course you fought well. You beat back many, left plenty of bodies on the ground. Is that what you wish to hear?" He chose his next words carefully.
"And believe in that?"
"Knowing it."
"Aye, knowing it. Then ye also know that the redcoats I don't stop tomorrow, because I am not there to do so, will kill even more of my kinsmen than they might have."
She gasped and got to her feet. "I don't care about them. I care about you." But even as she said it, she realised he was right. Many more lives would be lost.
"Believe this, lass. Know this, that if I do not fight tomorrow, even if what ye claim is true, I would never forgive myself."
"I don't care," she said, even though she sounded like a petulant child. "At least you'll be alive in your misery." He laughed and stood. She lunged around him and stood between him and the doorknob, clasping it behind her as if she could control him completely if she only held on tightly enough.
"One more kiss, for luck."
She shook her head. He grasped her chin and she resisted, but half-heartedly. She knew if she gave in to this last kiss, she was kissing him goodbye. But in her heart she had to admit she couldn't really stop the man. He was as determined to go as Jackie had been, and he was about to walk out of her life, with or without a kiss. She released the doorknob, stepped forward, and lifted her arms around his neck. "For luck." He kissed her gently once more. Her tears wet both their faces, but that couldn't stop her from telling him silently just how much she had loved him. Would love him for the next 300 years at least. The embrace ended abruptly, however, when the room lit up. They both hurried around the remnants of the bed to the side window. Shouting voices pierced the night air. A fire, a block away, ate up the sides of a large barn. Animals fled out the doors and in all directions, with no urging needed from the men trying to save them.
"It's a distraction. Mullins."
He hurried back to the door. Like waving away a pest, he flicked the chair out of his way, then faced her.
"Go home, Asa. I'll find ye, I swear it, and pray for us all."
He pulled the door open and was gone. She felt instantly empty, and after a minute's hesitation she ran after him. By the time she reached the larder, he was already at the back door with his kilt and weapons in his arms. He gave her one last smile, his image lit by the fire outside, the leggings, the long skirt. He looked like a very pirate absconding with her heart. "Gerard, I will pray for you." He winked.
"And I shall pray your prophecy is wrong."
Chapter 17. Nessa raced up the stairs in search of a rear window. She had to know that he'd gotten away. The smallest bedchamber was the only room with a view to the back, and she had to climb onto a chest of drawers in order to see out of the high window. Finally, She found the figure she was looking for. His dark shirt made him little more than a shadow at the side of the barn. He disappeared again, and she held her breath while she watched the steps, praying no one would follow after him. The light of the barn fire had dimmed, as had the shouting. She'd delayed him too long. Jean Eve's barn sat back so far on the hill she couldn't see all of it, but she was certain Gerard hadn't come back out again. Was there another door in the rear? How could she know he wasn't inside at the moment, fighting for his life? She was no use to him hiding inside the house, and she'd be no use to him flying around the hillside with a bloody sail of a dress billowing around her. What she needed were men's clothes, and luckily, their absent host hadn't taken everything with him. By the time Nessa emerged out the back of the house, the light of the fire was gone. Voices murmured from down the way, a man soothing his animals, a burst of laughter from the pub across the street. She strode up the steps as though she had every right to be on the property, then walked casually to the barn as Gerard had done earlier during the storm. Again, she held her breath while she reached for the latch. The door swung easily. Her hesitation was brief before she stepped into the darkness beyond. "Hello?" she called softly, not fool enough to use any names. A figure emerged from the darkest shadows. It was not Gerard, but a face she'd never seen before.
"For whom have you come?"
the man asked. There was a flare of orange light, then a lantern shuddered close behind him. There were others then. An ambush? Or friends of Paddy Mullen's?
"State your business, laddie."
The stranger had taken a good look at her, and still believed she was a lad. Apparently the cap covered her hair well enough, just as the one she'd worn for nearly 300 years. She nodded. "I only wanted to make certain nothing unfortunate has happened to a friend." The man nodded.
"And your friend?"
"Who are you?" She folded her arms and refused to say more. He shook his head, just as unwilling to share information.
"If your friend is Ross, he has already gone. The last cart is full, but we always have room for one willing to fight for Jimmy."
Jimmy? James. King James Stuart, and father to the Bonnie Prince. But did she really wish to witness the massacre again? Gerard's words came back to her, his argument. How many would die because he wasn't there to fight? Mercy. How many would die because she wasn't there to fight? She could still remember the angry face of the one man she'd fought and killed, while her life's blood seeped from her wound. How many others would he have gone on to kill had she not stopped him? Heaven help her, she had to go. Finally she understood what compelled her brother and the rest. Of course they had to go. Of course they had to fight. Even knowing what would happen, the mud, the frustration, the suffering, the inhumanity. She had not the luxury of sitting by while others fought for Scotland. No, for each other. "I will fight for my brothers," she told the stranger. And as she followed the man out the rear door and crawled beneath an oiled tarp, she prayed he was a Jacobite. Travelling was slow as the cart she'd climbed into was pulled by a pair of oxen. It was slightly tortuous because of the combination of smells emanating from the 4 men beneath the tarp with her. The tarp was tied across the top with rope, but thankfully, a bit of slack at the edge invited a tiny but cool breeze toward her face. Thanks to her warm clothes and warmer companions, the small draught didn't chill her, as it would have otherwise. The road was rough, but no one complained. The drover had to wind his way past roadblocks on the main thoroughfares. From a distance, in the dark, it was simply too difficult to tell which side held the roads. And if they were stopped by the redcoats, she knew all too well what would happen. If not a rushed firing squad, then imprisonment for her fellows at least. When a charge of treason was involved, there would be no rules of conduct for the victors. Indeed, the order of the day would be no quarter given. Amazingly enough, Nessa was able to sleep a bit during the trek to the battlefield. With her newfound understanding, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since the first time Jackie had left home. It was the only explanation she had for the quality of rest she enjoyed. Quality rest in the back of a bumpy cart, with a bunch of smelly men on the way to their deaths. Unfathomable. All intentions of taking her place on the moor were suddenly made impossible when she found herself standing in an unfamiliar field. Her stomach sank. They hadn't been Jacobites at all. They'd been luring sympathisers away from the fighting. She accosted the drover as he turned his oxen around on the road. "This is not Drumossie Moor."
Drumossie? Nay, a mile further north. But this is where I was ordered to bring ye, and no further. My animals are worn to the bone. Give off."
He pulled his shirt out of her grasp and gave his oxen a tap with his whip. At a faster pace than he'd moved previously, the animals pulled the cart away into the darkness. Without the aid of a lantern they'd come, which meant the man had known the way well enough to travel it blind. So it stood to reason he knew precisely where Drumossie Moor lay.
"Where is the rest of the army?"
asked one of her fellows. "How could I have forgotten? They've gone on the night raid." But even if they had, Ross wouldn't have arrived early enough to join them. So where was he? "Shall we head north?" Since men wouldn't appreciate orders from a young lad, she posed it as a question, then prayed they'd agree.
"Unless ye plan to do more than pick your teeth, laddie,"
a man said.
"Of course we go north."
Chapter 18. They trekked for less than an hour, staying close to the road but not on it, for fear they'd be easy targets for some confused soldier from either side. Eventually the ground became familiar and she knew they'd arrived. Before she had to make some excuse for stopping where she did, they came upon a larger party and were welcomed and ordered to wait. She might not have been able to smell a thing after she'd risen from her grave, but she clearly remembered the smell of the moor before it had been washed with blood. They couldn't be far. She laughed, feeling like a horse that suddenly turned her head for home again. She was eager to see it, to be reminded of how it looked so long ago. Before the great visitor centre, before the memorial cairn, before the houses encroached upon sacred ground. Words spread of the raiding party that had gone off into the night to catch the enemy by surprise. The soldiers gathered around her believed they were waiting for word of yet another Jacobite victory. Surely it would be the final straw, and George and his royal get would flee to Europe while they all paraded south. She bit her tongue and moved amongst them, hoping for a glimpse of Gerard Ross. But there were too many men huddled together in the darkness, trying to keep warm. He could be any one of 100 dark forms. So she leaned against a tree, closed her eyes, and hoped to hear his voice. She woke in the eerie light before dawn to see a large, brow-beaten party of Highlanders returning from the failed raid. The welcoming party was speechless when they learned that instead of a victory parade, they would be meeting Cumberland's army head-on. A few grumbled about the numbers and the odds, others made fools of the warriors. Nessa had nothing but pity for them all. She kept an eye out for her brother, but didn't see him. She didn't worry, however, because she knew just where he would stand when the fighting started. And where she would stand as well. From there, she would be able to find Gerard Ross. The battle aside, she knew what would follow for the next 3 centuries. Ross would be known as number 57, and she as Kennedy, number 55. He would suspect she haunted the moor for a reason different than the others. He wouldn't know she haunted him. And when, at last, she gave him her name, he would know her as the vengeful Nessa and not the gentle Asa. If history would repeat itself, she would rather it repeated to the letter. Otherwise, the man might hound her every step on the moor, if only to berate her for not returning home as he'd ordered. Besides, she'd already kissed the man in the flesh. To be near him for so long and unable to feel his lips on hers would be unbearable torture. Yes, that was an excellent reason to keep herself apart from him. But in truth, she didn't want him to recognize her on the moor because, ultimately, if he didn't really care for her, 269 years was a long time to mourn a broken heart. As morning drew on, the battlefield was chosen. The assignments were made. Clanranald, who had enjoyed the place of honour at Prestonpans, was now assigned to the left wing of the front line. The Camerons were given the honour of the right. Sadly, it would only be the right wing to reach the enemy lines and engage. The rest would be cut down by artillery, while their progress was halted by the moor itself. She tried not to remember the rest. It would be hard enough to keep a brave face. It would do her no good to recall every bit of the nightmare to come. Out of the corner of her eye, a familiar movement. Gerard Ross strode back toward the right flank. She watched him for only a heartbeat or two before he was lost in the sea of Highlanders between them. But no matter, he would be back. She made her way along the rear of the line, to MacDougall of Keppoch's regiment. There she held back, not wanting to let her kin recognise her for a while yet. She needed everything to happen as it had that day. As in the past, she was sent on an errand to fetch water. Over and over again she returned to the small spring that would later be known as the Well of the Dead. Gerard returned to Clanranald's ranks, and joked and laughed with familiar friends. Nessa revelled in the sound of that laughter. After he rose from the dead, his laughter would be more rare, which was a pity, for the sound of it could fairly bring a body back to life again. A bugle announced the hour, noon. It was just about time to make her presence known to her brother.
Heaven help me, I am no coward.
Someone bumped into her. Beg pardon? Nessa nodded, then noted the familiar clothes as the lad walked ahead of her. They were her clothes, or rather, the clothes she'd traded her dress for. Centuries before, as she'd followed after Jackie, she'd gone looking for water and found a deserter hiding in the woods. And since they both needed disguises, she'd traded her dress for his clothes. Lucky for her, he'd been desperate to get away, so she'd been able to dress privately. She'd left the long shirt tail hanging down the back. No! Chapter 19. Nessa lunged forward, her fingers outstretched to catch the back of the jacket, but her progress was halted by a hand on her shoulder. She glared behind her, recognised the black-clad figure of Wickham, then fought to be free. She had to stop the other her. The first things to disintegrate, like grain in the wind, were the tips of her own fingers, then her hand, her forearm, and soon the entire battlefield before her disappeared, while the grip on her shoulder gave a point of reference. She closed her eyes, not wanting to see what lay ahead, heartbroken by all she'd left behind. Only yards from Jackie again, she might have told him she understood, might have asked him to forgive her.
But Nessa,
Sonny said, standing beside her now.
With one more conversation between the pair of you, history might have been changed. And you don't want that in the end.
Nessa nodded. A sudden wave of exhaustion reminded her she was still in mortal form. She was back at the other Culloden, the one she knew so well. It was night once more, and standing on the north side of Lennox Cottage, she had no view of the battlefield or the memorial cairn. Wickham walked around to stand before her. He lowered his head and gave her a wink, then moved over to the bench and sat. Nessa knew what would come next and faced the witch.
I do not care for your boon, son Saray. And well I know it.
The witch wrinkled her nose, and Nessa wondered if perhaps she smelled as bad as her fellows in the cart. But the only thing she could sense was the smell of Dunvegan House and fried chicken lingering on her fine but thread-worn costume.
Will I be going on then?
Again, Sonny made a face.
Liam McGregor has since been sent from the Moor, by the way.
Nessa pretended interest.
Oh, and Gerard Ross will be next.
Aye? She suddenly grew nervous, realising that the man's ghost was, at that moment, somewhere on the far side of the cottage.
I dunna wish to see him.
Sonny frowned, then strode to the bench to have a quiet word with her uncle. After a moment of fervent discussion, the witch straightened. The man eventually nodded, and the lass came back to grin at Nessa.
Like I said, Ross is next, and I could use a hand with him, if you must know.
Nessa didn't understand. A hand with him? The girl shrugged.
You've waited all this time to move on, Nessa Kennedy. I'm asking if you'd like to wait a wee longer and lend a hand with Ross's quest.
Will I see him again then? Och, aye. Sonny's eyes flashed with mischief. She shook her head. I prefer he remembers me as he will. The witch's mouth dropped open.
I told ye,
sang Wickham. Sonny cast the man a frown and tried again.
You found your peace, Kennedy. You wish for your brother and yourself to see eye to eye. And though he never came around to your way of thinking, you came around to his. In the end, it was the same wish. But remember, it was Ross who helped you to see through Jackie's eyes. I only thought you might be able to repay him somehow.
I'm grateful, but no, I will not force my way into the man's heart, Let me be. Sonny folded her arms and clicked her tongue.
I never thought I'd see the day when Nessa Kennedy turned coward.
Nessa shook her head and turned away. She dared not go far for fear of drawing ghostly attention. But the flare of temper she expected from being called a coward never came, and she returned to Sonny with a smile. Call me Asa. She shrugged her shoulders and appreciated the fact that a weight was now missing from them.
My need for vengeance is behind me. Asa will serve me just as well.
Sonny tilted her head to one side and grinned.
That's fine then, fine. But I wonder...
What? The witch shook her head.
It wouldn't be fair to goad you into a fit of jealousy. Never mind. I'll send you on to the peace you've earned.
Jealousy? Sonny shrugged.
Well, Ross will soon be on a quest for a noble deed.
Aye.
And there is sure to be a woman involved.
Nessa's chest constricted. What woman? The bedroom at Dunvegan House came to mind, and kissing, and sitting on laps. But the woman she now envisioned sitting across Ross's knees was not her, and something powerful and primal filled her lungs. Sonny shrugged again, and wouldn't look her in the eye. What woman?
Now, Asa, I shouldn't have goaded you. The name is Nessa. Now, tell me, who is she to Gerard Ross?
Sonny laughed. It's not like I can tell the future, can I? I might read a mind or two on occasion, but I'll do it. Nessa knew she had been manipulated, but she didn't care. She wasn't about to let Gerard go out into the world with all those women touring the country, hunting for their personal versions of the famous Jamie Fraser. Not if she was given the opportunity to protect him. Sonny put a hand behind her ear. Pardon? Nessa took a deep breath and forced the words through her teeth. I'll do anything it takes. With her face lit and her eyes flashing, the crafty witch glanced briefly at her uncle, then at Nessa.
Funny you should say it like that.
The temporary end.
This has been Kennedy, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 13, written by L. Muir. Narrated by Jenn McGuirk and Andrew McDermott. Copyright 2015 by Leslie Muir Lytle. Production copyright by Leslie Muir Lytle.